Black Rebellion, 5 Slave Revolts by Thomas Wentworth Higginson, first published in 1889. The Maroons of Jamaica. The Maroons, it was a word of peril once, and terror spread along the skirts of the Blue Mountains of Jamaica when some fresh foray of those unconquered guerrillas swept down from the outlying plantations, startled the assembly from its order, General Williamson from his billiards and Lord Balcarres from his diplomatic ease, endangering, according to the official statement, public credit, civil rights, and the prosperity, if not the very existence of the country, until they were persuaded to make peace at last. They were the Circassians of the New World, but they were black instead of white, and as the Circassians refused to be transferred from the Sultan to the Tsar, so the Maroons refused to be transferred from Spanish dominion to English, and thus their revolt began. The difference is that while the white mountaineers numbered 400,000 and only defied Nicholas, the black mountaineers numbered less than 2,000 and defied Cromwell. And while the Circassians, after years of revolt, were at last subdued, the Maroons, on the other hand, who rebelled in 1655, were never conquered, but only made a compromise of allegiance, and exist as a separate race today. When Admirals Penn and Venables landed in Jamaica in 1655, there was not a remnant left of the 60,000 natives whom the Spaniards had found there a century and a half before. Their pitiful tale is told only by those caves, still known among the mountains, where thousands of human skeletons strew the ground. In their place dwelt 2 foreign races, an effeminate, ignorant, indolent white community of 1,500, with a black slave population quite as large and infinitely more hardy and energetic. The Spaniards were readily subdued by the English. The Negroes remained unsubdued. The slaveholders were banished from the island. The slaves only exiled themselves to the mountains. Thence the English could not dislodge them, nor the buccaneers whom the English employed, and when Jamaica subsided into a British colony, and peace was made with Spain, and the children of Cromwell's Puritan soldiers were beginning to grow rich by importing slaves for Roman Catholic Spaniards, the Maroons still held their own wild empire in the mountains, and, being sturdy heathens every one, practiced obeah rites in approved pagan fashion. The word Maroon is derived, according to one etymology, from the Spanish word marrano, a wild boar. These fugitives being all boar hunters, according to another, from Maroni, a river separating French and Dutch Guiana, where a colony of them dwelt and still dwells, and by another still. From Cimarron, a word meaning untamable, and used alike for apes and runaway slaves. But whether these rebel marauders were regarded as monkeys or men, they made themselves equally formidable. As early as 1663, the governor and council of Jamaica offered to each Maroon who should surrender his freedom and 20 acres of land, but not one accepted the terms. During 40 years, 44 acts of assembly were passed in respect to them, and at least £250,000 were expended in the warfare against them. In 1733, the force employed in this service consisted of 2 regiments of regular troops and the whole militia of the island, but the assembly said that the Maroons had within a few years greatly increased, notwithstanding all the measures that had been concerted for their suppression, to the great terror of His Majesty's subjects, and to the manifest weakening and preventing the further increase of strength in inhabitants of the island. The special affair in progress, at the time of these statements, was called Cudjoe's War. Cudjoe was a gentleman of extreme brevity and blackness, whose full-length portrait can hardly be said to adorn Dallas's history of the Maroons, but he was as formidable a guerrilla too as Marion. Under his leadership, the various bodies of fugitives were consolidated into one force and thoroughly organized. Cudjoe, like Shamil, was religious as well as military head of his people. By obeah influence, he established a thorough Freemasonry among both slaves and insurgents. No party could be sent forth by the government, but he knew it in time to lay an ambush or descend with fire and sword on the region left unprotected. He was thus always supplied with arms and ammunition, and as his men were perfect marksmen, never wasted a shot and never risked a battle. His forces naturally increased, while those of his opponents were decimated. His men were never captured and never took a prisoner. It was impossible to tell when they were defeated. In dealing with them, as Pelissius said of the Arabs, peace was not purchased by victory, and the only men who could obtain the slightest advantage against them were the imported Mosquito Indians or the Black Shot, a company of government Negroes. For 9 full years this particular war continued unchecked, General Williamson ruling Jamaica by day and Cudjoe by night. The rebels had every topographical advantage, for they held possession of the cockpits Those highlands are furrowed through and through, as by an earthquake, with a series of gaps or ravines resembling the California canyons, or those similar fissures in various parts of the Atlantic states, known to local fame either poetically as ice glens or symbolically as purgatories. These Jamaica chasms vary from 200 yards to a mile in length. The rocky walls are 50 or 100 feet high and often absolutely inaccessible, while the passes at each end admit but one man at a time. They are thickly wooded. Wherever trees can grow, water flows within them, and they often communicate with one another, forming a series of traps for an invading force. Tired and thirsty with climbing, the weary soldiers toil on in single file without seeing or hearing an enemy. Up the steep and winding path they traverse one cockpit, then enter another. Suddenly, a shot is fired from the dense and sloping forest on the right. Then another, and another, each dropping its man. The startled troops face hastily in that direction when a more murderous volley is poured from the other side. The heights above flash with musketry, while the precipitous path by which they came seems to close in fire behind them. By the time the troops have formed in some attempt at military order, the woods around them are empty, and their agile and noiseless foes have settled themselves into ambush again, farther up the defile, ready for a second attack, if needed. But one is usually sufficient, disordered, exhausted, bearing their wounded with them. The soldiers retreat in panic, if permitted to escape at all, and carry fresh dismay to the barracks, the plantations, and the government house. It is not strange, then, that high military authorities at that period should have pronounced the subjugation of the Maroons a thing more difficult than to obtain a victory over any army in Europe. Moreover, these people were fighting for their liberty, with which aim no form of warfare seemed to them unjustifiable, and the description given by Lafayette of the American Revolution was true of this one. The grandest of causes, won by contests of sentinels and outposts, the utmost hope of a British officer ordered against the Maroons was to lay waste a provision ground or cut them off from water. But there was little satisfaction in this. The wild pine leaves and the grapevine, why this supplied the rebels with water, and their plantation grounds were the wild pineapple and the plantain groves, and the forests where the wild boars harbored, and the ringdoves were as easily shot as if they were militiamen. Nothing but sheer weariness of fighting seems to have brought about a truce at last, and then a treaty between those high contracting parties, Cudjoe and General Williamson. But how to execute a treaty between these wild children of the mist and respectable diplomatic Englishmen? To establish any official relations without the medium of a preliminary bullet required some ingenuity of maneuvering. Cudjoe was willing, but inconveniently cautious. He would not come halfway to meet any one. Nothing would content him but an interview in his own chosen cockpit. So he selected one of the most difficult passes, posting in the forests a series of outlying parties to signal, with their horns, one by one, the approach of the plenipotentiaries, and then to retire on the main body. Through this line of dangerous sentinels, therefore, Colonel Guthrie and his handful of men bravely advanced. Horn after horn they heard sounded, but there was no other human noise in the woods, and they had advanced till they saw the smoke of the maroon huts before they caught a glimpse of a human form. A conversation was at last opened with the invisible rebels. On their promise of safety, Dr. Russell advanced alone to treat with them. Then several Maroons appeared, and finally Cudjoe himself. The formidable chief was not highly military in appearance, being short, fat, humpbacked, dressed in a tattered blue coat without skirts or sleeves and an old felt hat without a rim. But if he had blazed with regimental scarlet, he could not have been treated with more distinguished consideration. Indeed, in that case, the exchange of hats with which Dr. Russell finally volunteered, in Maroon fashion, to ratify negotiations might have been a less severe test of good fellowship. This fine stroke of diplomacy had its effect, however. The rebel captains agreed to a formal interview with Colonel Guthrie and Captain Sadler, and a treaty was at last executed with all due solemnity under a large cotton tree at the entrance of Guthrie's defile. This treaty recognized the military rank of Captain Cudjoe, Captain Accompong, and the rest, gave assurance that the Maroons should be forever hereafter in a perfect state of freedom and liberty, ceded to them 1,500 acres of land, and stipulated only that they should keep the peace, should harbor no fugitive from justice or from slavery, and should allow 2 white commissioners to remain among them, simply to represent the British government. During the following year, a separate treaty was made with another large body of insurgents, called the Windward Maroons. This was not effected, however, until after an unsuccessful military attempt, in which the mountaineers gained a signal triumph. By artful devices, a few fires left burning with old women to watch them, a few provision grounds exposed by clearing. Away the bushes, they lured the troops far up among the mountains, and then surprised them by an ambush. The militia all fled, and the regulars took refuge under a large cliff in a stream, where they remained 4 hours up to their waists in water, until finally they forded the river, under full fire with terrible loss. 3 months after this, however, the Maroons consented to an amicable interview, exchanging hostages first. The position of the white hostage, at least, was not the most agreeable. He complained that he was beset by the women and children with indignant cries of "Bukra, Bukra," while the little boys pointed their fingers at him as if stabbing him, and that with evident relish. However, Captain Quao, like Captain Cudjoe, made a treaty at last, and hats were interchanged. Instead of hostages, independence being thus won and acknowledged, there was a suspension of hostilities for some years. Among the wild mountains of Jamaica, the Maroons dwelt in a savage freedom. So healthful and beautiful was the situation of their chief town that the English government has erected barracks there of late years, as being the most salubrious situation on the island. They breathed an air 10 degrees cooler than that inhaled by the white population below, and they lived on a daintier diet, so that the English epicures used to go up among them for good living. The mountaineers caught the strange land crabs, plodding in companies of millions, their sidelong path from mountain to ocean, and from ocean to mountain again. They hunted the wild boars, and prepared the flesh by salting and smoking it in layers of aromatic leaves, the delicious jerked hog of buccaneer annals. They reared cattle and poultry, cultivated corn and yams, plantains and cocos, guavas and papaws and mamies and avocados and all luxurious West Indian fruits. The very weeds of their orchards had tropical luxuriance in their fragrance and in their names, and from the doors of their little thatched huts they looked across these gardens of delight to the magnificent lowland forests, and over those again to the faint line of far-off beach, the fainter ocean horizon, and the illimitable sky. They had senses like those of American Indians, tracked each other by the smell of the smoke of fires in the air, and called to each other by horns, using a special note to designate each of their comrades, and distinguishing it beyond the range of ordinary hearing. They spoke English diluted with Spanish and African words, and practiced obeah rites quite undiluted with Christianity. Of course, they associated largely with the slaves, without any very precise regard to treaty stipulations, sometimes brought in fugitives, and sometimes concealed them, left their towns, and settled on the planters' lands when they preferred them, but were quite orderly and luxuriously happy. During the formidable insurrection of the Coromantun slaves in 1760, they played a dubious part. When left to go on their own way, they did something towards suppressing it, but when placed under the guns of the troops, and ordered to fire on those of their own color, they threw themselves on the ground without discharging a shot. Nevertheless, they gradually came up into reputable standing. They grew more and more industrious and steady, and after they had joined very heartily in resisting D'Estaing's threatened invasion of the island in 1779, it became the fashion to speak of our faithful and affectionate Maroons. In 1795, their position was as follows. Their numbers had not materially increased, for many had strayed off and settled on the outskirts of plantations, nor materially diminished, for many runaway slaves had joined them, while there were also separate settlements of fugitives who had maintained their freedom for 20 years. The white superintendents had lived with the Maroons in perfect harmony, without the slightest official authority, but with a great deal of actual influence. But there was an irrepressible conflict behind all this apparent peace, and the slightest occasion might, at any moment, revive all the old terror. That occasion was close at hand. Captain Cudjoe and Captain Accompong, and the other founders of Maroon independence, had passed away, and old Montague reigned in their stead in Trelawney town. Old Montague had all the pomp and circumstance of Maroon majesty. He wore a laced red coat and a hat superb, with gold lace and plumes. None but captains could sit in his presence. He was helped first at meals, and no woman could eat beside him. He presided at councils as magnificently as at table, though with less appetite, and possessed, meanwhile, not an atom of the love or reverence of any human being. The real power lay entirely with Major James, the white superintendent, who had been brought up among the Maroons by his father and predecessor, and who was the idol of this wild race. In an evil hour, the government removed him and put a certain unpopular captain, Craskell in his place, and as there happened to be, about the same time, a great excitement concerning a hopeful pair of young Maroons who had been seized and publicly whipped on a charge of hog stealing, their kindred refused to allow the new superintendent to remain in the town. A few attempts at negotiation only brought them to a higher pitch of wrath, which ended in their dispatching the following peculiar diplomatic note. To the Earl of Balcarres, the Maroons wishes nothing else from the country but battle, and they desires not to see Mr. Craskell up here at all. So they are waiting every moment for the above on Monday. Mr. David Shaw will see you on Sunday morning for an answer. They will wait till Monday, 9 o'clock, and if they don't come up, they will come down themselves. Signed, Colonel Montague and all the rest. It turned out at last that only 2 or 3 of the Maroons were concerned in this remarkable defiance, but meanwhile it had its effect. Several ambassadors were sent among the insurgents and were so favorably impressed by their reception as to make up a subscription of money for their hosts. On departing, only the gallant Colonel Gallimore, a Jamaica Camillus, 5, gave iron instead of gold by throwing some bullets into the contribution box, and it was probably in accordance with his view of the subject that, when the Maroons sent ambassadors, in return, they were at once imprisoned, most injudiciously and unjustly, and when old Montague himself and 37 others following were seized and imprisoned also, it is not strange that the Maroons, joined by many slaves, were soon in open insurrection. Martial law was instantly proclaimed throughout the island. The fighting men among the insurgents were not perhaps more than 500, against whom the government could bring nearly 1,500 regular troops and several thousand militiamen. Lord Balcarres himself took the command, and eager to crush the affair, promptly marched a large force up to Trelawney town, and was glad to march back again as expeditiously as possible. In his very first attack he was miserably defeated, and had to fly for his life amid a perfect panic of the troops, in which some 40 or 50 were killed, including Colonel Sanford, commanding the regulars, and the bullet-loving Colonel Gallimore, in command of the militia, while not a single Maroon was even wounded, so far as could be ascertained. After this a good deal of bush-fighting took place. The troops gradually got possession of several Maroon villages, but not till every hut had been burnt by its owner. It was in the height of the rainy season, and between fire and water, the discomfort of the soldiers was enormous. Meanwhile, the Maroons hovered close around them in the woods, heard all their orders, picked off their sentinels, and, penetrating through their lines at night, burned houses and destroyed plantations far below. The only man who could cope with their peculiar tactics was Major James, the superintendent, just removed by government, and his services were not employed, as he was not trusted. On one occasion, however, he led a volunteer party farther into the mountains than any of the assailants had, yet penetrated, guided by tracks known to himself only, and by the smell of the smoke of Maroon fires. After a very exhausting march, including a climb of 150 feet up the face of a precipice, he brought them just within the entrance of Guthrie's defile. "So far," said he, pointing to the entrance, "you may pursue, but no farther. No force can enter here. No white man except myself or some soldier of the Maroon establishment has ever gone beyond this. With the greatest difficulty I have penetrated 4 miles farther, and not 10 Maroons have gone so far as that. There are 2 other ways of getting into the defile, practicable for the Maroons, but not for any one of you. In neither of them can I ascend or descend with my arms, which must be handed to me, step by step, as practiced by the Maroons themselves. One of the ways lies to the eastward, and the other to the westward, and they will take care to have both guarded. If they suspect that I am with you, which from the route you have come today, they now see you, and if you advance 50 paces more, they will convince you of it." At this moment a Maroon horn sounded the notes indicating his name, and as he made no answer, a voice was heard, inquiring if he were among them. "If he is," said the voice, "let him go back. We do not wish to hurt him. But as for the rest of you, come on and try battle if you choose." But the gentlemen did not choose. In September, the House of Assembly met. Things were looking worse and worse. For 5 months a handful of Negroes and mulattoes had defied the whole force of the island, and they were defending their liberty by precisely the same tactics through which their ancestors had won it. £500,000 sterling had been spent within this time, besides the enormous loss incurred by the withdrawal of so many able-bodied men from their regular employments. Cultivation was suspended, says an eyewitness. The courts of law had long been shut up, and the island at large seemed more like a garrison under the power of law martial than a country of agriculture and commerce. of civil judicature, industry, and prosperity. Hundreds of the militia had died of fatigue. Large numbers had been shot down. The most daring of the 6 British officers had fallen, while the insurgents had been invariably successful, and not one of them was known to have been killed. Captain Craskell, the banished superintendent, gave it to the assembly as his opinion that the whole slave population of the island was in sympathy with the Maroons and would soon be beyond control. More alarming still, there were rumors of French emissaries behind the scenes. And though these were explained away, the vague terror remained. Indeed, the lieutenant governor announced in his message that he had satisfactory evidence that the French convention was concerned in the revolt. A French prisoner, named Muranson, had testified that the French agent at Philadelphia, Fauché, had secretly sent 150 emissaries to the island and threatened to land 1,500 Negroes. And though Muranson took it all back at last, yet the assembly was moved to make a new offer of $300 for killing or taking a Trelawney Maroon, and $150 for killing or taking any fugitive slave who had joined them. They also voted £500 as a gratuity to the Accompong tribe of Maroons who had thus far kept out of the insurrection. And various prizes and gratuities were also offered by the different parishes with the same object of self-protection. The commander-in-chief being among the killed, Colonel Walpole was promoted in his stead and brevetted as general by way of incentive. He found a people in despair, a soldiery thoroughly intimidated, and a treasury not empty, but useless. But the new general had not served against the Maroons for nothing, and was not ashamed to go to school to his opponents. First, he waited for the dry season. Then he directed all his efforts towards cutting off his opponents from water, and most effectual move of all, he attacked each successive cockpit by dragging up a howitzer with immense labor and throwing in shells. Shells were a visitation not dreamed of in Maroon philosophy, and their quaint compliments to their new opponent remain on record. "Damn dat little buckra," they said. "He cunning more dan dem toter. Dis here de new fashion for fight. Him fire big ball arter you and win. Big ball top de damn something fire arter you again." With which Parthian arrows of rhetoric the mountaineers retreated. But this did not last long. The Maroons soon learned to keep out of the way of the shells, and the island relapsed into terror again. It was deliberately resolved at last, by a special council convoked for the purpose, to persuade the rebels to make peace. But as they had not as yet shown themselves very accessible to softer influences, it was thought best to combine as many arguments as possible, and a certain Colonel Quarrel had hit upon a wholly new one. His plan simply was, since men, however well disciplined, had proved powerless against Maroons, to try a Spanish fashion against them and use dogs. The proposition was met in some quarters with the strongest hostility. England, it was said, had always denounced the Spaniards as brutal and dastardly for hunting down the natives of that very soil with hounds, and should England now follow the humiliating example? On the other side, there were plenty who eagerly quoted all known instances of zoological warfare. All Oriental nations, for instance, used elephants in war, and, no doubt, would gladly use lions and tigers also, but for their extreme carnivorousness and their painful indifference to the distinction between friend and foe. Why not then use these dogs, comparatively innocent and gentle creatures? At any rate, something must be done, the final argument always used when a bad or desperate project is to be made palatable. So it was voted at last to send to Havana for an invoice of Spanish dogs with their accompanying chasseurs, and the efforts at persuading the Maroons were postponed till the arrival of these additional persuasives. And when Colonel Quarrel finally set sail as commissioner to obtain the new allies, all scruples of conscience vanished in the renewal of public courage and the chorus of popular gratitude. A thing so desirable must be right. Thrice they were armed who knew their quarrel just. But after the parting notes of gratitude died away in the distance, the commissioner began to discover that he was to have a hard time of it. He sailed for Havana in a schooner manned with Spanish renegados who insisted on fighting everything that came in their way. First a Spanish schooner, then a French one. He landed at Batabano, struck across the mountains towards Havana, stopped at Besucal to call on the wealthy Marquesa de San Felipe y San Jorge, grand patroness of dogs and chasseurs, and finally was welcomed to Havana by Don Luis de las Casas, who overlooked for this occasion only an injunction of his court against admitting foreigners within his government, the only accustomed exception being, as Don Luis courteously assured him, in favor of foreign traders who came with new Negroes. To be sure, the commissioner had not brought any of these commodities, but then he had come to obtain the means of capturing some. and so might pass for an irregular practitioner of the privileged profession. Accordingly, Don Guillermo dos Corral, so ran his passport, found no difficulty in obtaining permission from the governor to buy as many dogs as he desired. When, however, he carelessly hinted at the necessity of taking also a few men who should have care of the dogs, this being, after all, the essential part of his expedition. Don Luis de las Casas put on instantly a double force of courtesy and assured him of the entire impossibility of recruiting a single Spaniard for English service. Finally, however, he gave permission and passports for 6 chasseurs. Under cover of this, the commissioner lost no time in enlisting 40. He got them safe to Batabano, but at the last moment, learning the state of affairs, they refused to embark on such very irregular authority. When he had persuaded them, at length, the officer of the fort interposed objections. This was not to be borne, so Don Guillermo bribed him and silenced him. A dragoon was, however, sent to report to the governor. Don Guillermo sent a messenger after him and bribed him too, and thus, at length, after myriad rebuffs, and after being obliged to spend the last evening at a puppet show in which the principal figure was a burlesque on his own personal peculiarities, the weary Don Guillermo, with his crew of renegados and his 40 chasseurs and their 104 muzzled dogs, set sail for Jamaica. These new allies were certainly something formidable, if we may trust the pictures and descriptions in Dallas's history. The chasseur was a tall, meager, swarthy Spaniard or mulatto, lightly clad in cotton shirt and drawers, with broad straw hat and moccasins of raw hide, his belt sustaining his long, straight, flat sword or machete, like an iron bar sharpened at one end, and he wore by the same belt 3 cotton leashes for his 3 dogs, sometimes held also by chains. The dogs were a fierce breed, crossed between hound and mastiff, never unmuzzled, but for attack, and accompanied by smaller dogs called finders. It is no wonder, when these wild and powerful creatures were landed at Montego Bay, that terror ran through the town. Doors were everywhere closed and windows crowded. Not a Negro dared to stir, and the muzzled dogs, infuriated by confinement on shipboard, filled the silent streets with their noisy barking and the rattling of their chains. How much would have come of all this in actual conflict does not appear. The Maroons had already been persuaded to make peace upon certain conditions and guarantees, a decision probably accelerated by the terrible rumors of the bloodhounds, though they never saw them. It was the declared opinion of the Assembly, confirmed by that of General Walpole, that nothing could be clearer than that, if they had been off the island, the rebels could not have been induced to surrender. Nevertheless, a treaty was at last made, without the direct intervention of the quadrupeds. Again commissioners went up among the mountains to treat with negotiators at first invisible. Again were hats and jackets interchanged, not without coy reluctance on the part of the well-dressed Englishmen, and a solemn agreement was effected. The most essential part of the bargain was a guarantee of continued independence, demanded 8 by the suspicious Maroons. General Walpole, however, promptly pledged himself that no such unfair advantage should be taken of them as had occurred with the hostages previously surrendered, who were placed in irons, nor should any attempt be made to remove them from the island. It is painful to add that this promise was outrageously violated by the colonial government, to the lasting grief of General Walpole, on the ground that the Maroons had violated the treaty by a slight want of punctuality in complying with its terms, and by remissness in restoring the fugitive slaves who had taken refuge among them. As many of the tribe as surrendered, therefore, were at once placed in confinement, and ultimately shipped from Port Royal to Halifax, to the number of 600, on the June 6, 1796. For the credit of English honor, we rejoice to know that General Walpole not merely protested against this utter breach of faith, but indignantly declined the sword of honor which the Assembly had voted him, in its gratitude, and then retired from military service forever. The remaining career of this portion of the Maroons is easily told. They were first dreaded by the inhabitants of Halifax, then welcomed when seen, and promptly set to work on the citadel. Then in process of reconstruction, where the Maroon bastion still remains, their only visible memorial. 2 commissioners had charge of them, one being the redoubtable Colonel Quarrel, and £25,000 were appropriated for their temporary support. Of course they did not prosper. Pensioned colonists never do, for they are not compelled into habits of industry. After their delicious life in the mountains of Jamaica, it seemed rather monotonous to dwell upon that barren soil, for theirs was such that 2 previous colonies had deserted it, and in a climate where winter lasts 7 months in the year, they had a schoolmaster, and he was also a preacher, but they did not seem to appreciate that luxury of civilization utterly refusing on grounds of conscience to forsake polygamy, and on grounds of personal comfort to listen to the doctrinal discourses of their pastor, who was an ardent Sandemanian. They smoked their pipes during service time and left old Montague, who still survived, to lend a vicarious attention to the sermon. One discourse he briefly reported as follows, very much to the point, Massa Parsons say. No must thief, no must meddle with somebody wife, no must quarrel, must set down softly. So they sat down very softly, and showed an extreme unwillingness to get up again. But not being naturally an idle race, at least in Jamaica the objection lay rather on the other side. They soon grew tired of this inaction, distrustful of those about them, suspicious of all attempts to scatter them among the community at large, frozen by the climate, and constantly petitioning for removal to a milder one. They finally wearied out all patience. A long dispute ensued between the authorities of Nova Scotia and Jamaica, as to which was properly responsible for their support, and thus the heroic race, that for a century and a half had sustained themselves in freedom in Jamaica, were reduced to the position of troublesome and impracticable paupers, shuttlecocks between two selfish parishes. So passed their unfortunate lives until, in 1800, their reduced population was transported to Sierra Leone at a cost of £6,000, since which they disappear from history. It was judged best not to interfere with those bodies of Maroons which had kept aloof from the late outbreak at the Accompong settlement and elsewhere. They continued to preserve a qualified independence and retain it even now. In 1835, 2 years after the abolition of slavery in Jamaica, there were reported 60 families of Maroons as residing at Accompong town, 80 families at Moortown, 110 families at Charlestown, and 20 families at Scott Hall, making 270 families in all, each station being, as of old, under the charge of a superintendent. But there can be little doubt that under the influences of freedom they are rapidly intermingling with the massive colored population in Jamaica. The story of the exiled Maroons attracted attention in high quarters. In its time, the wrongs done to them were denounced in Parliament by Sheridan and mourned by Wilberforce, while the employment of bloodhounds against them was vindicated by Dundas, and the whole conduct of the colonial government defended, through thick and thin, by Bryan Edwards. This thorough partisan even had the assurance to tell Mr. Wilberforce in Parliament that he knew the Maroons from personal knowledge to be cannibals, and that if a missionary were sent among them in Nova Scotia, they would immediately eat him. A charge so absurd that he did not venture to repeat it in his history of the West Indies, though his injustice to the Maroons is even there so glaring as to provoke the indignation of the more moderate Dallas. But, in spite of Mr. Edwards, the public indignation ran quite high in England against the bloodhounds and their employers, so that the Home Ministry found it necessary to send a severe reproof to the colonial government. For a few years, the tales of the Maroons thus emerged from mere colonial annals and found their way into annual registers and parliamentary debates, but they have long since vanished from popular memory. Their record still retains its interest, however, as that of one of the heroic races of the world, and all the more because it is with their kindred that the American nation has to deal in solving one of the most momentous problems of its future career, the Maroons of Suriname. When that eccentric individual, Captain John Gabriel Stedman, resigned his commission in the English Navy, took the oath of abjuration, and was appointed ensign in the Scots Brigade. Employed for 2 centuries by Holland, he little knew that their high mightinesses, the states of the United Provinces, would send him out, within a year, to the forests of Guyana to subdue rebel Negroes. He never imagined that the year 1773 would behold him beneath the rainy season in a tropical country, wading through marshes and splashing through lakes, exploring with his feet for submerged paths, commanding impracticable troops, and commanded by an insufferable colonel, feeding on gree-gree worms and fed upon by mosquitoes, howled at by jaguars, hissed at by serpents, and shot at by those exceedingly unattainable gentlemen, still longed for, never seen, the Maroons of Suriname. Yet as our young ensign sailed up the Suriname River, the world of tropic beauty came upon him with enchantment. Dark, moist verdure was close around him, rippling waters below, the tall trees of the jungle and the low mangroves beneath were all hung with long vines and lianas, a maze of cordage, like a fleet at anchor. Lithe monkeys traveled ceaselessly up and down these airy paths, in armies, bearing their young. Like knapsacks on their backs, macaws and hummingbirds, winged jewels, flew from tree to tree. As they neared Paramaribo, the river became a smooth canal among luxuriant plantations. The air was perfumed music, redolent of orange blossoms and echoing with the songs of birds and the sweet plash of oars. Gay barges came forth to meet them, while groups of naked boys and girls were promiscuously playing and flouncing like so many tritons and mermaids in the water. And when the troops disembarked, 500 fine young men, the oldest not 30, all arrayed in new uniforms and bearing orange flowers in their caps, a bridal wreath for beautiful Guyana. It is no wonder that the Creole ladies were in ecstasy. And the boyish recruits little foresaw the day when, reduced to a few dozens, barefooted and ragged as filibusters, their last survivors would gladly re-embark from a country beside which even Holland looked dry and even Scotland comfortable. For over all that earthly paradise there brooded not alone its terrible malaria, its days of fever and its nights of deadly chill, but the worst shadows of oppression and of sin, which neither day nor night could banish. The first object which met Stedman's eye, as he stepped on shore, was the figure of a young girl stripped to receive 200 lashes and chained to a 100-pound weight, and the few first days gave a glimpse into a state of society worthy of this exhibition: men without mercy, women without modesty, the black man a slave to the white man's passions, and the white man a slave to his own. The later West Indian society in its worst forms is probably a mere dilution of the utter profligacy of those early days. Greek or Roman decline produced nothing more debilitating or destructive than the ordinary life of a Suriname planter, and his one virtue of hospitality only led to more unbridled excesses and completed the work of vice. No wonder that Stedman himself, who with all his peculiarities was essentially simple and manly, soon became disgusted and made haste to get into the woods and cultivate the society of the Maroons. The rebels against whom this expedition was sent were not the original Maroons of Suriname, but a later generation. The originals had long since established their independence, and their leaders were flourishing their honorary silver-mounted canes in the streets of Paramaribo. Fugitive Negroes had begun to establish themselves in the woods from the time when the colony was finally ceded by the English to the Dutch in 1674. The first open outbreak occurred in 1726 when the plantations on the Saramacca River revolted. It was found 11 impossible to subdue them, and the government very imprudently resolved to make an example of 11 captives and thus terrify the rest of the rebels. They were tortured to death, 8 of the 11 being women. This drove the others to madness, and plantation after plantation was visited with fire and sword. After a long conflict, their chief, Adoe, was induced to make a treaty. In 1749, the rebels promised to keep the peace, and in turn were promised freedom, money, tools, clothes, and finally arms and ammunition. But no permanent peace was ever made upon a barrel of gunpowder as a basis, and of course an explosion followed this one. The colonists naturally evaded the last item of the bargain, and the rebels, receiving the gifts and remarking the omission of the part of Hamlet, asked contemptuously if the Europeans expected Negroes to subsist on combs and looking-glasses. New hostilities at once began. A new body of slaves on the Asia River revolted. The colonial government was changed in consequence, and fresh troops shipped from Holland, and after 4 different embassies had been sent into the woods, the rebels began to listen to reason. The black generals, Captain Araby and Captain Boston, agreed upon a truce for a year, during which the colonial government might decide for peace or war, the Maroons declaring themselves indifferent. Finally, the government chose peace, delivered ammunition, and made a treaty. In 1761, the white and black plenipotentiaries exchanged English oaths and then Negro oaths, each tasting a drop of the other's blood during the latter ceremony. Amid a volley of remarkable incantations from the black gentleman or priest, after some final skirmishes, in which the rebels almost always triumphed, the treaty was at length accepted by all the various villages of Maroons. Had they known that at this very time 5,000 slaves in Berbice were just rising against their masters and were looking to them for assistance, the result might have been different, but this fact had not reached them, nor had the rumors of insurrection in Brazil among Negro and Indian slaves. They consented, therefore, to the peace. They write from Suriname, says the Annual Register for January 23, 1761, that the Dutch governor, finding himself unable to subdue the rebel Negroes of that country by force, hath wisely followed the example of Gov. Trelawney at Jamaica, and concluded an amicable treaty with them, in consequence of which all the Negroes of the woods are acknowledged to be free, and all that is past is buried in oblivion. So ended a war of 36 years, and in Stedman's day the original 3,000 Uka and Saramacca Maroons had multiplied, almost incredibly, to 15,000 But for those slaves not sharing in this revolt, it was not so easy to bury the whole past in oblivion. The Maroons had told some very plain truths to the white ambassadors and had frankly advised them, if they wished for peace, to mend their own manners and treat their chattels humanely. But the planters learned nothing by experience, and indeed the terrible narrations of Stedman were confirmed by those of Alexander, so lately as 1831. Of course, therefore, in a colony comprising 80,000 blacks to 4,000 whites, other revolts were stimulated by the success of this one. They reached their highest point in 1772, when an insurrection on the Catawba River, led by a Negro named Barron, almost gave the finishing blow to the colony, the only adequate protection being found in a body of slaves, liberated expressly for that purpose, a dangerous and humiliating precedent. We have been obliged to set 300 or 400 of our stoutest Negroes free to defend us, says an honest letter from Suriname, in the Annual Register for September 5, 1772. Fortunately for the safety of the planters, Barron presumed too much upon his numbers, and injudiciously built a camp too near the seacoast, in a marshy fastness, from which he was finally ejected by 1,200 Dutch troops, though the chief work was done, Stedman thinks, by the Black Rangers or liberated slaves. Checked by this defeat, he again drew back into the forests, resuming his guerrilla warfare against the plantations. Nothing could dislodge him. Bloodhounds were 12 proposed, but the moisture of the country made them useless. And thus matters stood when Stedman came sailing, amid orange blossoms and music, up the winding Suriname. Our young officer went into the woods in the condition of Falstaff, heinously unprovided. Coming from the unbounded luxury of the plantations, he found himself entering the most horrid and impenetrable forests where no kind of refreshment was to be had, he being provisioned only with salt pork and peas. After a wail of sorrow for this inhuman neglect, he bursts into a gush of gratitude for the private generosity which relieved his wants at the last moment by the following list of supplies: 24 bottles, best claret, 12 ditto Madeira, 12 ditto porter, 12 ditto cider, 12 ditto rum, 2 large loaves white sugar, 2 gallons brandy, 6 bottles muscadel, 2 gallons lemon juice, 2 gallons ground coffee, 2 large Westphalia hams, 2 salted bullock's tongues, 1 bottle Durham mustard, 6 dozen spermaceti candles. The hams and tongues seem indeed rather a poor halfpennyworth to this intolerable deal of sack, but this instance of Suriname privation in those days may open some glimpse at the colonial standards of comfort. From this specimen, moralizes our hero, the reader will easily perceive that, if some of the inhabitants of Suriname show themselves the disgrace of the creation by their cruelties and brutality, others, by their social feelings, approve themselves an ornament to the human species. With this instance of virtue and generosity, I therefore conclude this chapter. But the troops soon had to undergo worse troubles than those of the commissariat. The rainy season had just set in. As for the Negroes, said Mr. Klinthouse, the last planter with whom they parted, you may depend on never seeing a soul of them, unless they attack you off guard. But the climate will murder you all, bringing with them constitutions already impaired by the fevers and dissipation of Paramaribo. The poor boys began to perish long before they began to fight, wading in water all day, hanging their hammocks over water at night. It seemed a moist existence, even compared with the climate of England and the soil of Holland. It was a case of invent a shovel and be a magistrate, even more than Andrew Marvell found it in the United Provinces. In fact, Raynal evidently thinks that nothing but Dutch experience in hydraulics could ever have cultivated Suriname. The 2 gunboats which held one division of the expedition were merely old sugar barges roofed over with boards and looking like coffins. They were pleasantly named the Charon and the Cerberus, but Stedman thought that the sudden death and the willful murder would have been titles more appropriate. The chief duty of the troops consisted in lying at anchor at the intersections of wooded streams, waiting for rebels who never came. It was dismal work, and the raw recruits were full of the same imaginary terrors which have haunted other heroes less severely tested. The monkeys never rattled the cocoa nuts against the trees, but they all heard the axes of maroon wood choppers, and when a sentinel declared one night that he had seen a Negro go down the river in a canoe with his pipe lighted, the whole force was called to arms against a firefly. In fact, the insect race brought by far the most substantial dangers. The rebels eluded the military, but the chigras, locusts, scorpions, and bush spiders were ever ready to come halfway to meet them. Likewise, serpents and alligators proffered them the freedom of the forests, and exhibited a hospitality almost excessive. Snakes 20 feet long hung their seductive length from the trees. Jaguars volunteered their society through almost impenetrable marshes. Vampire bats perched by night with lulling endearments upon the toes of the soldiers. When Stedman describes himself as killing 38 mosquitoes at one stroke, we must perhaps pardon something to the spirit of martyrdom. But when we add to these the other woes of his catalog, prickly heat, ringworm, putrid fever, the growling of Colonel Fougeot, dry sandy savannas, unfordable marshes, burning hot days, cold and damp nights, heavy rains, and short allowance, we can hardly wonder that 3 captains died in a month, and that in 2 months his detachment of 42 was reduced to a miserable 7. Yet, through all this, Stedman himself kept his health. His theory of the matter almost recalls the time-honored prescription of a light heart and a thin pair of breeches, for he attributes his good condition to his keeping up his spirits and kicking off his shoes. Daily bathing in the river had also something to do with it, and indeed hydropathy was first learned of. The West India Maroons, who did their packing in wet clay, and was carried by Dr. Wright to England, but his extraordinary personal qualities must have contributed most to his preservation. Never did a meager, starved, black, burnt, and ragged tatterdemalion, as he calls himself, carry about him such a fund of sentiment, philosophy, poetry, and art. He had a great faculty for sketching, as the engravings in his volumes, with all their odd peculiarities, show. His deepest woes he coined always into couplets, and fortified himself against hopeless despair with Ovid and Valerius Flaccus, Pope's Homer and Thomson's Seasons. Above all reigned his passion for natural history, a ready balm for every ill. Here he was never wanting to the occasion, and to do justice to Dutch Guiana, the occasion never was wanting to him. Were his men sickening, the peccaries were always healthy without the camp, and the cockroaches within, just escaping from a she-jaguar. He satisfies himself, ere he flees, that the print of her claws on the sand is precisely the size of a pewter dinner plate. Bitten by a scorpion, he makes sure of a scientific description in case he should expire of the bite. Is the water undrinkable? There is at least some rational interest in the number of legs possessed by the centipedes which preoccupy it. This is the highest triumph of man over his accidents, when he thus turns his pains to gains and becomes an entomologist in the tropics. Meanwhile, the rebels kept their own course in the forests, and occasionally descended upon plantations beside the very river on whose upper waters the useless troops were sickening and dying. Stedman himself made several campaigns, with long intervals of illness before he came any nearer to the enemy than to burn a deserted village or destroy a rice field. Sometimes they left the Charon and the Cerberus moored by grapevines to the pine trees and made expeditions into the woods, single file. Our ensign, true to himself, gives the minutest schedule of the order of march and the oddest little diagram of mannequins with cocked hats and blacker mannequins bearing burdens. First, Negroes with billhooks to clear the way, then the vanguard, then the main body, interspersed with Negroes bearing boxes of ball cartridges, then the rear guard, with many more Negroes bearing camp equipage, provisions, and new rum, surnamed Kill Devil, and appropriately followed by a sort of palanquin for the disabled. Thus arrayed, they marched valorously forth into the woods to some given point. Then they turned, marched back to the boats, then rode back to camp, and straightway went into the hospital. Immediately upon this, the coast being clear, Barron and his rebels marched out again and proceeded to business. In the course of years, these Maroons had acquired their own peculiar tactics. They built stockaded fortresses on marshy islands, accessible by fords which they alone could traverse. These they defended further by sharp wooden pins, or crow's feet, concealed beneath the surface of the miry ground, and, latterly, by the more substantial protection of cannon, which they dragged into the woods and learned to use. Their bushfighting was unique. Having always more men than weapons, they arranged their warriors in threes, one to use the musket, another to take his place if wounded or slain, and a third to drag away the body. They had Indian stealthiness and swiftness, with more than Indian discipline, discharged their fire with some approach to regularity, in 3 successive lines, the signals being given by the captain's horn. They were full of ingenuity, marked their movements for each other by scattered leaves, and blazed trees, ran zigzag to dodge bullets, gave wooden guns to their unarmed men to frighten the plantation Negroes on their guerrilla expeditions, and borrowed the red caps of the black rangers whom they slew to bewilder the aim of the others. One of them, finding himself close to the muzzle of a ranger's gun, threw up his hand hastily. 14 what? He exclaimed. Will you fire on one of your own party? God forbid, cried the ranger. dropping his piece, and was instantly shot through the body by the Maroon, who the next instant had disappeared in the woods. These rebels were no saints. Their worship was Obi worship. The women had not far outgrown the plantation standard of chastity, and the men drank kill devil like their betters. Stedman was struck with the difference between the meaning of the word good in rebellious circles and in reputable. It must, however, be observed that what we Europeans call a good character was by the Africans looked upon as detestable, especially by those born in the woods, whose only crime consisted in avenging the wrongs done to their forefathers. But if martial virtues be virtues, such were theirs. Not a rebel ever turned traitor or informer, ever flinched in battle, or under torture, ever violated a treaty or even a private promise. But it was their power of endurance which was especially astounding. Stedman is never weary of paying tribute to this, or of illustrating it in sickening detail. Indeed, the records of the world show nothing to surpass it. The lifted axe, the agonizing wheel, proved powerless to subdue it. With every limb lopped, every bone broken, the victims yet defied their tormentors, laughed, sang, and died triumphant. Of course they repaid these atrocities in kind. If they had not, it would have demonstrated the absurd paradox that slavery educates higher virtues than freedom. It bewilders all the relations of human responsibility if we expect the insurrectionary slave to commit no outrages. If slavery has not depraved him, it has done him little harm. If it be the normal tendency of bondage to produce saints like Uncle Tom, let us all offer ourselves at auction immediately. It is Cassie and Dread who are the normal protests of human nature against systems which degrade it. Accordingly, these poor, ignorant Maroons, who had seen their brothers and sisters flogged, burned, mutilated, hanged on iron hooks, broken on the wheel, and had been all the while solemnly assured that this was paternal government, could only repay the paternalism in the same fashion when they had the power. Stedman saw a Negro chained to a red-hot distillery furnace. He saw disobedient slaves, in repeated instances, punished by the amputation of a leg and sent to boat service for the rest of their lives. And of course the rebels borrowed these suggestions. They could bear to watch their captives expire under the lash, for they had previously watched their parents. If the government rangers received 25 florins for every rebel right hand, which they brought in, of course they risked their own right hands in the pursuit. The difference was that the one brutality was that of a mighty state, and the other was only the retaliation of the victims. And after all, Stedman never ventures to assert that the imitation equaled the original, or that the Maroons had inflicted nearly so much as they had suffered. The leaders of the rebels, especially, were men who had each his own story of wrongs to tell. Baron, the most formidable, had been the slave of a Swedish gentleman who had taught him to read and write, taken him to Europe, promised to manumit him on his return, and then, breaking his word, sold him to a Jew. Baron refused to work for his new master, was publicly flogged under the gallows, fled to the woods next day, and became the terror of the colony. Jolicoeur, his first captain, was avenging the cruel wrongs of his mother. Bonnie, another leader, was born in the woods, his mother having taken refuge there just previously to escape from his father, who was also his master. Kojo, another, had defended his master against the insurgents until he was obliged by ill usage to take refuge among them. And he still bore upon his wrist, when Stedman saw him, a silver band with the inscription, "True to the Europeans." In dealing with wrongs like these, Mr. Carlyle would have found the despised Negroes quite as ready as himself to take the total abstinence pledge against Rosewater. In his first 2 months' campaign, Stedman never saw the trace of a Maroon. In the second, he once came upon their trail. In the third, one captive was brought in, 2 surrendered themselves voluntarily, and a large party was found to have crossed a river within a mile of the camp, ferrying themselves on palm trunks, according to their fashion. Deep swamps and scorching sands, toiling through briars all day, and sleeping at night in hammocks suspended over stagnant water, with weapons supported on sticks crossed beneath. All this was endured for 2 years and a half before Stedman personally came in sight of the enemy. On August 20th, 1775, the troops found themselves at last in the midst of the rebel settlements. These villages and forts bore a variety of expressive names, such as, "Hide me, O thou, surrounding verdure, I shall be taken, the woods lament for me, disturb me, if you dare, take a tasting, if you like it, come, try me, if you be men. God knows me, and none else, I shall molder before I shall be taken." Some were only plantation grounds with a few huts and were easily laid waste, but all were protected more or less by their mere situations. Quagmires surrounded them, covered by a thin crust of verdure, sometimes broken through by one man's weight when the victim sank hopelessly into the black and bottomless depths below. In other directions there was a solid bottom, but inconveniently covered by 3 or 4 feet of water, through which the troops waded breast deep, holding their muskets high in the air, unable to reload them when once discharged, and liable to be picked off by rebel scouts who ingeniously posted themselves in the tops of palm trees. Through this delectable region Colonel Fougeot and his followers slowly advanced, drawing near the fatal shore where Captain Malin's detachment had just been defeated, and where their mangled remains still polluted the beach. Passing this point of danger without attack, they suddenly met a small party of rebels, each bearing on his back a beautifully woven hamper of snow-white rice. These loads they threw down and disappeared. Next appeared an armed body from the same direction, who fired upon them once and swiftly retreated, and in a few moments, the soldiers came upon a large field of standing rice, beyond which lay, like an amphitheater, the rebel village. But between the village and the field had been piled successive defenses of logs and branches, behind which simple redoubts the Maroons lay concealed. A fight ensued, lasting 40 minutes, during which nearly every soldier and ranger was wounded, but to their great amazement, not one was killed. This was an enigma to them until after the skirmish, when the surgeon found that most of them had been struck, not by bullets, but by various substitutes, such as pebbles, coat buttons, and bits of silver coin, which had penetrated only skin deep. We also observed that several of the poor rebel Negroes, who had been shot, had only the shards of spa-water cans instead of flints, which could seldom do execution. And it was certainly owing to these circumstances that we came off so well. The rebels at length retreated, first setting fire to their village. 100 or more lightly built houses, some of them 2 stories high, were soon in flames, and as this conflagration occupied the only neck of land between 2 impassable morasses, the troops were unable to follow, and the Maroons had left nothing but rice fields to be pillaged. That night the military force was encamped in the woods. Their ammunition was almost gone, so they were ordered to lie flat on the ground. Even in case of attack, they could not so much as build a fire. Before midnight, an attack was made on them, partly with bullets and partly with words. The Maroons were all around them in the forest, but their object was a puzzle. They spent most of the night in bandying compliments with the Black Rangers, whom they alternately denounced, ridiculed, and challenged to single combat. At last Fougeot and Stedman joined in the conversation and endeavored to make this midnight volley of talk the occasion for a treaty. This was received with inextinguishable laughter, which echoed through the woods, like a concert of screech owls, ending in a charivari of horns and hallooing. The colonel, persisting, 16, offered them life, liberty, victuals, drink, and all they wanted. In return, they ridiculed him unmercifully. He was a half-starved Frenchman who had run away from his own country, and would soon run away from theirs. They profoundly pitied him and his soldiers. They would scorn to spend powder on such scarecrows. They would rather feed and clothe them, as being poor white slaves, hired to be shot at and starve for 4 pence a day. But as for the planters, overseers, and rangers, they should die, every one of them, and Bonnie should be governor of the colony. After this, they tinkled their billhooks, fired a volley, and gave 3 cheers, which being answered by the rangers, the clamor ended, and the rebels dispersed with the rising sun. Very aimless nonsense it certainly appeared, but the next day put a new aspect on it, for it was found that, under cover of all this noise, the Maroons had been busily occupied all night, men, women, and children, in preparing and filling great hampers of the finest rice, yams, and cassava from the adjacent provision grounds to be used for subsistence during their escape, leaving only chaff and refuse for the hungry soldiers. This was certainly such a masterly trait of generalship in a savage people, whom we affected to despise, as would have done honor to any European commander. From this time the Maroons fulfilled their threats, shooting down without mercy every Black Ranger who came within their reach. One of these rangers being, in Stedman's estimate, worth 6 white soldiers, they left Colonel Fougeot and his regulars to die of starvation and fatigue. The enraged colonel, finding himself thus foiled by a naked Negro, swore he would pursue Bonnie to the world's end. But he never got any nearer than to Bonnie's kitchen gardens. He put the troops on half allowance, sent back for provisions and ammunition, and within 10 days changed his mind and retreated to the settlements in despair. Soon after, this very body of rebels, under Bonnie's leadership, plundered 2 plantations in the vicinity. and nearly captured a powder magazine, which was, however, successfully defended by some armed slaves. For a year longer, these expeditions continued. The troops never gained a victory, and they lost 20 men for every rebel killed. But they gradually checked the plunder of plantations, destroyed villages and planting grounds, and drove the rebels, for the time at least, into the deeper recesses of the woods or into the adjacent province of Cayenne. They had the slight satisfaction of burning Bonnie's own house, a two-story wooden hut built in the fashion of our frontier guardhouses. They often took single prisoners, some child, born and bred in the woods and frightened equally by the first sight of a white man and of a cow, or some warrior, who, on being threatened with torture, stretched forth both hands in disdain, and said with Indian eloquence, "These hands have made tigers tremble." As for Stedman, he still went barefooted, still quarreled with his colonel, still sketched the scenery, and described the reptiles, still reared gree-gree worms for his private kitchen, still quoted good poetry and wrote execrable, still pitied all the sufferers around him, black, white, and red, until finally he and his comrades were ordered back to Holland in 1776. Among all that wasted regiment of weary and broken-down men, there was probably no one but Stedman who looked backward with longing as they sailed down the lovely Suriname. True, he bore all his precious collections with him, parrots and butterflies, drawings, on the backs of old letters, and journals kept on bones and cartridges, but he had left behind him a dearer treasure, for there runs through all his eccentric narrative a single thread of pure romance in his love for his beautiful quadroon wife and his only son. Within a month after his arrival in the colony, our susceptible ensign first saw Joanna, a slave girl of 15, at the house of an intimate friend. Her extreme beauty and modesty first fascinated him, and then her piteous narrative, for she was the daughter of a planter who, 17, had just gone mad and died in despair from the discovery that he could not legally emancipate his own children from slavery. Soon after, Stedman was dangerously ill, was neglected and alone. Fruits and cordials were anonymously sent to him, which proved at last to have come from Joanna, and she came herself ere long and nursed him, grateful for the visible sympathy he had shown to her. This completed the conquest. The passionate young Englishman, once recovered, loaded her with presents, which she refused, talked of purchasing her and educating her in Europe, which she also declined, as burdening him too greatly, and finally, amid the ridicule of all good society in Paramaribo, surmounted all legal obstacles, and was united to the beautiful girl in honorable marriage. He provided a cottage for her, where he spent his furloughs in perfect happiness for 4 years. The simple idyll of their loves was unbroken by any stain or disappointment, and yet always shadowed with the deepest anxiety for the future. Though treated with the utmost indulgence, she was legally a slave, and so was the boy of whom she became the mother. Kojo, her uncle, was a captain among the rebels against whom her husband fought, and up to the time when Stedman was ordered back to Holland, he was unable to purchase her freedom, nor could he, until the very last moment, procure the emancipation of his boy. His perfect delight at this last triumph, when obtained, elicited some satire from his white friends. While the well-thinking few highly applauded my sensibility, many not only blamed, but publicly derided me for my paternal affection, which was called a weakness, a whim. Nearly 40 beautiful boys and girls were left to perpetual slavery by their parents of my acquaintance, and many of them without being so much as once inquired after at all. But Stedman was a true-hearted fellow, if his sentiment did sometimes run to rodomontade. He left his Joanna only in the hope that a year or two in Europe would repair his ruined fortunes, and he could return to treat himself to the purchase of his own wedded wife. He describes, with unaffected pathos, their parting scene, though indeed there were several successive partings, and closes the description in a characteristic manner. My melancholy having surpassed all description, I at last determined to weather 1 or 2 painful years in her absence, and in the afternoon went to dissipate my mind at a Mr. Rue's cabinet of Indian curiosities, where, as my eye chanced to fall on a rattlesnake, I will, before I leave the colony, describe this dangerous reptile. It was impossible to write the history of the Maroons of Suriname, except through the biography of our ensign, at last promoted captain, because nearly all we know of them is through his quaint and picturesque narrative, with its profuse illustrations by his own hand. It is not fair, therefore, to end without chronicling his safe arrival in Holland. On June 3, 1777, It is a remarkable fact that, after his life in the woods, even the Dutch looked slovenly to his eyes. The inhabitants who crowded about us appeared but a disgusting assemblage of ill-formed and ill-dressed rabble. So much had my prejudices been changed by living among Indians and blacks. Their eyes seemed to resemble those of a pig. Their complexions were like the color of foul linen. They seemed to have no teeth, and to be covered over with rags and dirt. This prejudice, however, was not against these people only, but against all Europeans in general, when compared to the sparkling eyes, ivory teeth, shining skin, and remarkable cleanliness of those I had left behind me. Yet, in spite of these superior attractions, he never recrossed the Atlantic, for his Joanna died soon after, and his promising son, being sent to the father, was educated in England, became a midshipman in the Navy, and was lost at sea. With his elegy, in which the last depths of bathos are sadly sounded by a mourning parent, who is induced to print them only by the effect they had on the sympathetic and ingenious Mrs. Cowley, the narrative of a 5 years' expedition closes. The war, which had cost the government £40,000 a year, was ended and left both parties essentially as when it began. The Maroons gradually returned to their old abodes and, being unmolested themselves, left others unmolested thenceforward. Originally 3,000, in Stedman's time 15,000, they were estimated at 70,000 by Captain Alexander, who saw Guiana in 1831, and a later American scientific expedition, having visited them in their homes, reported them as still enjoying their wild freedom and multiplying, while the Indians on the same soil decay. The beautiful forests of Suriname still make the morning gorgeous with their beauty, and the night deadly with their chill. The stately palm still rears 100 feet in air, its straight gray shaft in its head. Of verdure, the mora builds its solid buttressed trunk, a pedestal. For the eagle, the pine of the tropics holds out its myriad hands, with watercups for the rain and dews, where all the birds and the monkeys may drink their fill. The trees are garlanded with epiphytes and convolvuli, and anchored to the earth by 1,000 vines. High among their branches, the red and yellow mockingbirds still build their hanging nests. Uncouth storks and tree porcupines cling above, and the spotted deer and the tapir drink from the sluggish stream below. The night is still made noisy with 1,000 cries of bird and beast, and the stillness of the sultry noon is broken by the slow tolling of the campanero, or bell-bird, far in the deep dark woods, like the chime of some lost convent. And as nature is unchanged there, so apparently is man. The Maroons still retain their savage freedom, still shoot their wild game and trap their fish, still raise their rice and cassava, yams and plantains, still make cups from the gourd tree and hammocks from the silkgrass plant, wine from the palm tree's sap, brooms from its leaves, fishing lines from its fibers, and salt from its ashes. Their life does not yield indeed the very highest results of spiritual culture. Its mental and moral results may not come up to the level of civilization, but they rise far above the level of slavery. In the changes of time, the Maroons may yet elevate themselves into the one, but they will never relapse into the other. Gabriel's defeat in exploring among dusty files of newspapers for the true records of Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner. I have caught occasional glimpses of a plot perhaps more wide in its outlines than that of either, which has lain obscure in the darkness of half a century, traceable only in the political events which dated from it, and the utter incorrectness of the scanty traditions which assumed to preserve it. And though researches in public libraries have only proved to me how rapidly the materials for American history are vanishing, since not one of our great institutions possessed, a few years since, a file of any Southern newspaper of the year 1800, yet the little which I have gained may have an interest that makes it worth preserving. 3 times, at intervals of 30 years, did a wave of unutterable terror sweep across the Old Dominion, bringing thoughts of agony to every Virginian master and of vague hope to every Virginian slave. Each time did one man's name become a spell of dismay and a symbol of deliverance. Each time did that name eclipse its predecessor, while recalling it for a moment to fresher memory. John Brown revived the story of Nat Turner, as in his day Nat Turner recalled the vaster schemes of Gabriel. On September 8, 1800, a Virginia correspondent wrote thus to the Philadelphia United States Gazette: "For the week past, we have been under momentary expectation of a rising among the Negroes, who have assembled to the number of 900 or 1,000, and threaten to massacre all the whites. They are armed with desperate weapons, and secrete themselves in the woods. God only knows our fate. We have strong guards every night under arms." It was no wonder if there were foundation for such rumors. Liberty was the creed or the cant of the day. France was being disturbed by revolution, and England by Clarkson. In America, slavery was habitually recognized as a misfortune and an error, only to be palliated by the nearness of its expected end. How freely anti-slavery pamphlets had been circulated in Virginia, we know from the priceless volumes collected and annotated by Washington and now preserved in the Boston Athenaeum. Jefferson's Notes on Virginia, itself an anti-slavery tract, had passed through 7 editions. Judge St. George Tucker, law professor in William and Mary College, had recently published his noble work, A Dissertation on Slavery, with a proposal for the gradual abolition of it in the state of Virginia. From all this agitation, a slave insurrection was a mere corollary. With so much electricity in the air, a single flash of lightning foreboded all the terrors of the tempest. Let but a single armed Negro be seen or suspected, and at once, on many a lonely plantation, there were trembling hands at work to bar doors and windows that seldom had been even closed before, and there was shuddering when a gray squirrel scrambled over the roof, or a shower of walnuts came down clattering from the overhanging boughs. Early in September 1800, as a certain Mr. Mosley Shepherd of Henrico County in Virginia was one day sitting in his counting room, 2 Negroes knocked at the door and were let in. They shut the door themselves and began to unfold an insurrectionary plot, which was subsequently repeated by one of them, named Ben Woodfolk or Woolfolk, in presence of the court on the 15th of the same month. He stated that about the 1st of the preceding June he had been asked by a Negro named Colonel George whether he would like to be made a Mason. He refused, but George ultimately prevailed on him to have an interview with a certain leading man among the blacks, named Gabriel. Arrived at the place of meeting, he found many persons assembled, to 20 whom a preliminary oath was administered, that they would keep secret all which they might hear. The leaders then began, to the dismay of this witness, to allude to a plan of insurrection, which, as they stated, was already far advanced toward maturity. Presently a man named Martin, Gabriel's brother, proposed religious services, caused the company to be duly seated, and began an impassioned exposition of Scripture, bearing upon the perilous theme. The Israelites were glowingly portrayed as a type of successful resistance to tyranny, and it was argued that, now as then, God would stretch forth his arm to save, and would strengthen 100 to overthrow 1,000. Thus passed, the witness stated, this preparatory meeting. At a subsequent gathering, the affair was brought to a point, and the only difficult question was whether to rise in rebellion upon a certain Saturday or upon the Sunday following. Gabriel said that Saturday was the day already fixed, and that it must not be altered, but George was for changing it to Sunday, as being more convenient for the country Negroes, who could travel on that day without suspicion. Gabriel, however, said decisively that they had enough to carry Richmond without them, and Saturday was therefore retained as the momentous day. This was the confession, so far as it is now accessible, and on the strength of it, Ben Woolfolk was promptly pardoned by the court for all his sins, past, present, or to come, and they proceeded with their investigation. Of Gabriel little appeared to be known, except that he had been the property of Thomas Prosser, a young man who had recently inherited a plantation a few miles from Richmond, and who had the reputation among his neighbors of behaving with great barbarity to his slaves. Gabriel was, however, reported to be a fellow of courage and intellect above his rank in life, to be about 25 years of age, and to be guiltless of the alphabet. Further inquiry made it appear that the preparations of the insurgents were hardly adequate to any grand revolutionary design. At least, if they proposed to begin with open warfare, the commissariat may have been well organized, for black Virginians are apt to have a prudent eye to the larder. But the Ordnance Department and the Treasury were as low as if Secretary Floyd had been in charge of them. A slave called Prosser's Ben testified that he went with Gabriel to see Ben Woolfolk, who was going to Caroline County to enlist men, and that Gabriel gave him 3 shillings for himself and 3 other Negroes to be expended in recruiting men. Their arms and ammunition, so far as reported, consisted of a peck of bullets, 10 pounds of powder, and 12 scythe swords, made by Gabriel's brother Solomon, and fitted with handles by Gabriel himself. These cutlasses, said subsequently a white eyewitness, are made of scythes cut in 2 and fixed into well-turned handles. I have never seen arms so murderous. Those who still doubt the importance of the conspiracy which has been so fortunately frustrated would shudder with horror at the sight of these instruments of death. And as it presently appeared that a conspirator named Scott had astonished his master by accidentally pulling $10 from a ragged pocket which seemed inadequate to the custody of 10 cents, it was agreed that the plot might still be dangerous, even though the resources seemed limited. And indeed, as was soon discovered, the effective weapon of the insurgents lay in the very audacity of their plan. If the current statements of all the Virginia letter writers were true, nothing could have been better contrived. It was to have taken effect on the first day of September. The rendezvous for the blacks was to be a brook 6 miles from Richmond. 1,100 men were to assemble there, and were to be divided into 3 columns, their officers having been designated in advance. All were to march on Richmond, then a town of 8,000 inhabitants, under cover of night. The right wing was instantly to seize upon the penitentiary building, just converted into an arsenal, while the left wing was to take possession of the powder house. These 2 columns were to be armed chiefly with clubs, as 21 their undertaking depended for success upon surprise, and was expected to prevail without hard fighting. But it was the central force, armed with muskets, cutlasses, knives, and pikes upon which the chief responsibility rested. These men were to enter the town at both ends simultaneously and begin a general carnage, none being excepted save the French inhabitants, who were supposed for some reason to be friendly to the Negroes. In a very few hours, it was thought, they would have entire control of the metropolis, and that this hope was not in the least unreasonable was shown by the subsequent confessions of weakness from the whites. They could scarcely have failed of success, wrote the Richmond correspondent of the Boston Chronicle, for, after all, we could only muster 400 or 500 men, of whom not more than 30 had muskets. For the insurgents, if successful, the penitentiary held several thousand. Stand of arms, the powder house was well stocked, the capital contained the state treasury, the mills would give them bread, the control of the bridge across James River would keep off enemies from beyond. Thus secured and provided, they planned to issue proclamations summoning to their standard their fellow Negroes and the friends of humanity throughout the continent. In a week, it was estimated, they would have 50,000 men on their side, with which force they could easily possess themselves of other towns. And indeed a slave named John Scott, possibly the dangerous possessor of the $10, was already appointed to head the attack on Petersburg. But in case of final failure, the project included a retreat to the mountains. With their newfound property, John Brown was therefore anticipated by Gabriel 60 years before in believing the Virginia mountains to have been created from the foundation of the world as a place of refuge for fugitive slaves. These are the statements of the contemporary witnesses. They are repeated in many newspapers of the year 1800 and are in themselves clear and consistent. Whether they are on the whole exaggerated or understated, it is now impossible to say. It is certain that a Richmond paper of Sept, quoted in the New York Gazette of Sept. 18, declares that the plot has been entirely exploded, which was shallow, and had the attempt been made to carry it into execution, but little resistance would have been required to render the scheme entirely abortive. But it is necessary to remember that this is no more than the Charleston newspapers said at the very crisis of Denmark Vesey's formidable plot. Last evening, wrote a lady from Charleston in 1822-25. 100 of our citizens were under arms to guard our property and lives. But it is a subject not to be mentioned so underscored, and unless you hear of it elsewhere, say nothing about it. Thus, it is always hard to know whether to assume the facts of an insurrection as above or below the estimates. This Virginian excitement also happened at a period of intense political agitation, and was seized upon as a boon by the Federalists. The very article above quoted is ironically headed Holy Insurrection, and takes its motto from Jefferson, with profuse capital letters, "The spirit of the master is abating, that of the slave rising from the dust, his condition mollifying." In view of the political aspect thus given to the plot, and of its ingenuity and thoroughness likewise, the Virginians were naturally disposed to attribute to white men some share in it, and speculation presently began to run wild. The newspapers were soon full of theories, no two being alike, and no one credible. The plot originated, some said, in certain handbills written by Jefferson's friend Callender, then in prison at Richmond on a charge of sedition. These were circulated by 2 French Negroes, aided by a United Irishman calling himself a Methodist preacher, and it was in consideration of these services that no Frenchman was to be injured by the slaves. When Gabriel was arrested, the editor of the United States Gazette affected much diplomatic surprise that no letters were yet found upon his person from Fries, Gallatin, or Duane, nor was he at the time of his capture accompanied by any United Irishman. He, however, acknowledges that there are others concerned, and that he is 22, not the principal instigator. All Federalists agreed that the Southern Democratic talk was constructive insurrection, which it certainly was, and they painted graphic pictures of noisy Jacobins over their wine and eager, dusky listeners behind their chairs. It is evident that the French principles of liberty and equality have been infused into the minds of the Negroes, and that the incautious and intemperate use of the words by some whites among us have inspired them with hopes of success, while the fiery hotspurs of the state vociferate their French babble of the natural equality of man. The insulted Negro will be constantly stimulated to cast away his cords and to sharpen his pike. It is, moreover, believed, though not positively known, that a great many of our profligate and abandoned whites, who are distinguished by the burlesque appellation of Democrats, are implicated with the blacks, and would have joined them if they had commenced their operations. The Jacobin printers and their friends are panic-struck. Never was terror more strongly depicted in the countenances of men. These extracts from 3 different Federalist newspapers show the amiable emotions of that side of the House, while Democratic Duane in the Aurora could find no better repartee than to attribute the whole trouble to the policy of the administration in renewing commercial intercourse with San Domingo. I have discovered in the Norfolk Epitome of the Times for October 9, 1800, a remarkable epistle written from Richmond jail by the unfortunate Callender himself. He indignantly denies the charges against the Democrats of complicity in dangerous plots, boldly retorting them upon the Federalists. An insurrection at this critical moment by the Negroes of the Southern states would have thrown everything into confusion, and consequently, it was to have prevented the choice of electors in the whole or the greater part of the states to the south of the Potomac. Such a disaster must have tended directly to injure the interests of Mr. Jefferson, and to promote the slender possibility of a second election of Mr. Adams. And to be sure, the United States Gazette followed up the thing with a good, single-minded party malice which cannot be surpassed in these present days, ending in such altitudes of sublime coolness as the following: the insurrection of the Negroes in the Southern states, which appears to be organized on the true French plan, must be decisive, with every reflecting man in those states, of the election of Mr. Adams and General Pinckney. The military skill and approved bravery of the general must be peculiarly valuable to his countrymen at these trying moments. Let us have a military vice president by all means to meet this formidable exigency of Gabriel's peck of bullets and this unexplained 3 shillings in the pocket of Prosser's Ben. But Gabriel's campaign failed, like that of the Federalists, and the appointed day brought disasters more fatal than even the sword of General Pinckney. The affrighted Negroes declared that the stars in their courses fought against Sisera. The most furious tempest ever known in Virginia burst upon the land that day. Instead of an insurrection, roads and plantations were submerged. Bridges were carried away. The fords, which then, as now, were the frequent substitutes for bridges in that region, were rendered wholly impassable. The Brook Swamp, one of the most important strategic points of the insurgents, was entirely inundated, hopelessly. Dividing Prosser's farm from Richmond, the country Negroes could not get in, nor those from the city get out. The 1,000 men dwindled to a few hundred, and these half paralyzed by superstition, there was nothing to do but to dismiss them. And before they could reassemble, they were betrayed. That the greatest alarm was instantly created throughout the community, there is no question. All the city of Richmond was in arms, and in all large towns of the state, the night patrol was doubled. It is a little amusing to find it formally announced that the governor, impressed with the magnitude of the danger, has appointed for himself 3 aides-de-camp. A troop of United States cavalry was ordered to Richmond. Numerous arrests were made. Men were 23 convicted on one day, and hanged on the next, 5, 6, 10, 15 at a time, almost without evidence. $300 were offered by Gov. Monroe for the arrest of Gabriel, as much more for another chief named Jack Bowler, alias Ditcher, whereupon Bowler, alias Ditcher, surrendered himself, but it took some weeks to get upon the track of Gabriel. He was finally captured at Norfolk, on board a schooner just arrived from Richmond, in whose hold he had concealed himself for 11 days, having thrown overboard a bayonet and bludgeon, which were his only arms. Crowds of people collected to see him, including many of his own color. He was arrested on Sept. 24, convicted on October 3, and executed on October 7, and it is known of him further only that, like almost all leaders of slave insurrections, he showed a courage which his enemies could not gainsay. When he was apprehended, he manifested the greatest marks of firmness and confidence, showing not the least disposition to equivocate or screen himself from justice, but making no confession that could implicate anyone else. The behavior of Gabriel under his misfortunes, said the Norfolk epitome of Sept. 25, was such as might be expected from a mind capable of forming the daring project which he had conceived. The United States Gazette for October 9 states, more sarcastically, that the general is said to have manifested the utmost composure, and with the true spirit of heroism seems ready to resign his high office, and even his life, rather than gratify the officious inquiries of the governor. Some of these newspapers suggest that the authorities found it good policy to omit the statement made by Gabriel, whatever it was. At any rate, he assured them that he was by no means the sole instigator of the affair. He could name many, even in Norfolk, who were more deeply concerned. To his brother Solomon, he is said to have stated that the real head of the plot was Jack Bowler. Still another leader was General John Scott, already mentioned, the slave of Mr. Greenhow, hired by Mr. M.C. Crea. He was captured by his employer in Norfolk, just as he was boldly entering a public conveyance to escape, and the Baltimore Telegraph declared that he had a written paper directing him to apply to Alexander Bidenhurst or Wedenhurst in Philadelphia, corner of Coates Alley and Bud Street, who would supply his needs. What became of this military individual, or of his Philadelphia sympathizers, does not appear, but it was noticed, as usually happens in such cases, that all the insurgents had previously passed for saints. It consists within my knowledge, says one letter writer, that many of these wretches who were or would have been partakers in the plot have been treated with the utmost tenderness by their masters, and were more like children than slaves. These appear to be all the details now accessible of this once famous plot. They were not very freely published, even at the time. The minutiae of the conspiracy have not been detailed to the public, said the Salem Mass. Gazette of October 7, and perhaps, through a mistaken notion of prudence and policy, will not be detailed in the Richmond papers. The New York Commercial Advertiser of October 13 was still more explicit. The trials of the Negroes concerned in the late insurrection are suspended until the opinions of the legislature can be had on the subject. This measure is said to be owing to the immense numbers who are interested in the plot, whose death, should they all be found guilty and be executed, will nearly produce the annihilation of the blacks in this part of the country. And in the next issue of the same journal, a Richmond correspondent makes a similar statement with the following addition: a conditional amnesty is perhaps expected. At the next session of the legislature of Virginia, they took into consideration the subject referred to them in secret session, with closed doors. The whole result of their deliberations has never yet been made public, as the injunction of secrecy has never been removed. To satisfy the court, the public, and themselves, they had a task so difficult to perform that it is not surprising that their deliberations were in secret. It is a matter of historical interest to know that in these mysterious sessions lay the germs of the American Colonization Society. A correspondence was at once secretly commenced between the governor of Virginia and the president of the United States, with a view to securing a grant of land where their troublesome slaves might be banished. Nothing came of it then, but in 1801, 1802, and 1804, these attempts were renewed, and finally, on January 22, 1805, the following vote was passed, still in secret session: resolved that the senators of this state in the Congress of the United States be instructed, and the representatives be requested, to use their best efforts for the obtaining from the general government a competent portion of territory in the state of Louisiana, to be appropriated to the residents of such people of color as have been or shall be emancipated, or hereafter may become dangerous to the public safety, etc. But of all these efforts, nothing was known till their record was accidentally discovered by Charles Fenton Mercer in 1816. He at once brought the matter to light and moved a similar resolution. In the Virginia legislature, it was almost unanimously adopted, and the first formal meeting of the Colonization Society, in 1817, was called in aid of this Virginia movement. But the whole correspondence was never made public until the Nat Turner insurrection of 1831 recalled the previous excitement, and these papers were demanded by Mr. Summers, a member of the legislature, who described them as having originated in a convulsion similar to that which had recently, but more terribly, occurred. But neither these subsequent papers, nor any documents which now appear accessible, can supply any authentic or trustworthy evidence as to the real extent of the earlier plot. It certainly was not confined to the mere environs of Richmond. The Norfolk epitome of October 6 states that on the 6th and 7th of the previous month 150 blacks, including 20 from Norfolk, were assembled near Whitlock's Mills in Suffolk County, and remained in the neighborhood till the failure of the Richmond plan became known. Petersburg newspapers also had letters containing similar tales. Then the alarm spread more widely. Near Edenton, NC, there was undoubtedly a real insurrection, though promptly suppressed. And many families ultimately removed from that vicinity in consequence. In Charleston, SC, there was still greater excitement, if the contemporary press may be trusted. It was reported that the freeholders had been summoned to appear in arms on penalty of a fine of £15, which many preferred to pay rather than risk taking the fever which then prevailed. These reports were, however, zealously contradicted in letters from Charleston, dated October 8, and the Charleston newspapers up to Sept. 17 had certainly contained no reference to any especial excitement. This alone might not settle the fact, for reasons already given, but the omission of any such affair from the valuable pamphlet published in 1822 by Edwin C. Holland, containing reminiscences of insurrections in South Carolina, is presumptive evidence that no very extended agitation occurred. But wherever there was a black population, slave or emancipated, men's startled consciences made cowards of them all, and recognized the Negro as a dangerous man, because an injured one. In Philadelphia, it was seriously proposed to prohibit the use of skyrockets for a time because they had been employed as signals in San Domingo. Even in Boston, said the New York Daily Advertiser of Sept. 20, fears are expressed and measures of prevention adopted. This probably refers to a singular advertisement which appeared in some of the Boston newspapers on Sept. 16 and runs as follows. Notice to blacks, the officers of the police having made returns to the subscriber of the names of the following persons who are Africans or Negroes, not subjects of the Emperor of Morocco nor citizens of any of the United States, the same are hereby warned and directed to depart out of 25 this Commonwealth before the 10th day of October next, as they would avoid the pains and penalties of the law in that case provided, which was passed by the legislature March 26, 1788. Charles Bulfinch, Superintendent. By order and direction of the selectmen. The names annexed are about 300, with the places of their supposed origin, and they occupy a column of the paper. So at least asserts the United States Gazette of Sept. 23. It seems probable, adds the editor, from the nature of the notice, that some suspicion of the design of the Negroes is entertained, and we regret to say there is too much cause. The law of 1788 above mentioned was an act for suppressing rogues, vagabonds, and the like, which forbade all persons of African descent, unless citizens of some one of the United States or subjects of the Emperor of Morocco, from remaining more than 2 months within the Commonwealth, on penalty of imprisonment and hard labor. This singular statute remained unrepealed until 1834. Amid the general harmony and the contemporary narratives of Gabriel's insurrection, it would be improper to pass by one exceptional legend, which by some singular fatality has obtained more circulation than all the true accounts put together. I can trace it no farther back than Nat Turner's time, when it was published in the Albany Evening Journal, thence transferred to the Liberator of September 17, 1831, and many other newspapers, then refuted in detail by the Richmond Enquirer of October 21, then resuscitated in the John Brown Epoch by the Philadelphia Press, and extensively copied. It is fresh, spirited, and full of graphic and interesting details, nearly every one of which is altogether false. Gabriel in this narrative becomes a rather mythical being, of vast abilities and lifelong preparations. He bought his freedom, it is stated, at the age of 21, and then traveled all over the southern states, enlisting Confederates and forming stores of arms. At length his plot was discovered, in consequence of 3 Negroes having been seen riding out of a stable yard together, and the governor offered a reward of $10,000 for further information, to which a Richmond gentleman added as much more. Gabriel concealed himself on board the Sally Ann, a vessel just sailing for San Domingo, and was revealed by his little nephew, whom he had sent for a jug of rum. Finally, the narrative puts an eloquent dying speech into Gabriel's mouth, and, to give a properly tragic consummation, causes him to be torn to death by 4 wild horses. The last item is, however, omitted in the more recent reprints of the story. Every one of these statements appears to be absolutely erroneous. Gabriel lived and died a slave, and was probably never out of Virginia. His plot was voluntarily revealed by accomplices. The rewards offered for his arrest amounted to $300 only. He concealed himself on board the schooner Mary, bound to Norfolk, and was discovered by the police. He died on the gallows, with 10 associates, having made no address to the court or the people. All the errors of the statement were contradicted when it was first made public, but they have proved very hard to kill Some of these events were embodied in a song bearing the same title with this essay, Gabriel is Defeat, and set to a tune of the same name, both being composed by a colored man. Several witnesses have assured me of having heard this sung in Virginia as a favorite air at the dances of the white people, as well as in the huts of the slaves. It is surely one of history's strange parallelisms that this fatal enterprise, like that of John Brown afterwards, should thus have embalmed itself in music. And 22 years after these events, their impressions still remain vivid enough for Benjamin Lundy, in Tennessee, to write, so well 26 had they matured their plot, and so completely had they organized their system of operations, that nothing but a seemingly miraculous intervention of the arm of Providence was supposed to have been capable of saving the city from pillage and flames, and the inhabitants thereof from butchery. So dreadful was the alarm, and so great the consternation produced on this occasion that a member of Congress from that state was some time after heard to express himself in his place as follows: "The night bell is never heard to toll in the city of Richmond, but the anxious mother presses her infant more closely to her bosom." The congressman was John Randolph of Roanoke, and it was Gabriel who had taught him the lesson, and longer than the melancholy life of that wayward statesman, down even to the beginning of the American Civil War, there lingered in Richmond a memorial of those days, most peculiar and most instructive, before the days of secession, when the northern traveler in Virginia, after traversing for weary leagues its miry ways, its desolate fields, and its flowery forests, rode at last into its metropolis, he was sure to be guided ere long to visit its stately capital, modeled by Jefferson when French minister, from the Maison Carrée. Standing before it, he might admire undisturbed the Grecian outline of its exterior, but he found himself forbidden to enter, save by passing an armed and uniformed sentinel at the doorway. No other state of the Union then found it necessary to protect its state house by a permanent cordon of bayonets. Yet there for half a century stood sentinel the public guard of Virginia, and when the traveler asked the origin of the precaution, he was told that it was the lasting memorial of Gabriel's defeat. 27. Denmark Vesey. On Saturday afternoon, May 25, 1820. 2. A slave named Devaney, belonging to Colonel Priolo of Charleston, SC, was sent to market by his mistress. The colonel being absent in the country, after doing his errands, he strolled down upon the wharves in the enjoyment of that magnificent wealth of leisure, which usually characterized the former house servant of the South, when beyond hail of the street door, he presently noticed a small vessel lying in the stream, with a peculiar flag flying. And while looking at it, he was accosted by a slave named William, belonging to Mr. John Paul, who remarked to him, "I have often seen a flag with the number 76, but never one with the number 96 upon it before." After some further conversation on this trifling point, William suddenly inquired, "Do you know that something serious is about to take place?" Devaney, disclaiming the knowledge of any graver impending crisis than the family dinner, the other went on to inform him that many of the slaves were determined to right themselves. "We are determined," he added, "to shake off our bondage, and for that purpose we stand on a good foundation. Many have joined, and if you will go with me, I will show you the man who has the list of names, and who will take yours down." This startling disclosure was quite too much for Devaney. He was made of the wrong material for so daring a project. His genius was culinary, not revolutionary. Giving some excuse for breaking off the conversation, he went forthwith to consult a free, colored man, named Pencil or Pencel, who advised him to warn his master instantly. So he lost no time in telling the secret to his mistress and her young son, and on the return of Colonel Priolo from the country, 5 days afterward, it was at once revealed to him. Within an hour or two he stated the facts to Mr. Hamilton, the intendant, or, as he would now be called, mayor. Mr. Hamilton at once summoned the corporation, and by 5 o'clock Devaney and William were under examination. This was the first warning of a plot which ultimately filled Charleston with terror. And yet so thorough and so secret was the organization of the Negroes that a fortnight passed without yielding the slightest information beyond the very little which was obtained from these two. William Paul was indeed put in confinement, and soon gave evidence inculpating 2 slaves as his employers, Mingo Harth and Peter Poyas. But these men, when arrested, behaved with such perfect coolness and treated the charge with such entire levity. Their trunks and premises, when searched, were so innocent of all alarming contents that they were soon discharged by the wardens. William Paul at length became alarmed for his own safety, and began to let out further facts piecemeal, and to inculpate other men. But some of those very men came voluntarily to the intendant on hearing that they were suspected, and indignantly offered themselves for examination. Puzzled and bewildered, the municipal government kept the thing as secret as possible, placed the city guard in an efficient condition, provided 1,600 rounds of ball cartridges, and ordered the sentinels and patrols to be armed with loaded muskets. Such had been our fancied security, that the guard had previously gone on duty without muskets, and with only sheathed bayonets and bludgeons. It has since been asserted, though perhaps on questionable authority, that the Secretary of War was informed of the plot, even including some details of the plan and the leader's name, before it was known in Charleston. If so, he utterly disregarded it, and, indeed, so well did the Negroes play their part, that the whole report was eventually disbelieved, while, as was afterwards proved, they went on to complete their secret organization, and hastened by a fortnight the appointed day of attack. Unfortunately for their plans, however, another betrayal took place at the very last moment from a different direction. A class leader in a Methodist 28 church had been persuaded or bribed by his master to procure further disclosures. He at length came and stated that about 3 months before, a man named Rolla, slave of Gov. Bennett, had communicated to a friend of his the fact of an intended insurrection, and had said that the time fixed for the outbreak was the following Sunday night, June 16th. As this conversation took place on Friday, it gave but a very short time for the city authorities to act, especially as they wished neither to endanger the city nor to alarm it. Yet so cautiously was the game played on both sides that the whole thing was still kept a secret from the Charleston public, and some members of the city government did not fully appreciate their danger till they had passed it. The whole was concealed, wrote the governor afterwards, until the time came, but secret preparations were made. Saturday night and Sunday morning passed without demonstrations. Doubts were excited and counter-orders issued for diminishing the guard. It afterwards proved that these preparations showed to the slaves that their plot was betrayed, and so saved the city without public alarm. Newspaper correspondence soon was full of the story, each informant of course hinting plainly that he had been behind the scenes all along, and had withheld it only to gratify the authorities in their policy of silence. It was now no longer a secret, they wrote, adding that for 5 or 6 weeks, but little attention had been paid by the community to these rumors, the city council having kept it carefully to themselves until a number of suspicious slaves had been arrested. This refers to 10 prisoners who were seized on June 18, an arrest which killed the plot and left only the terrors of what might have been. The investigation, thus publicly commenced, soon revealed a free-colored man named Denmark Vesey as the leader of the enterprise, among his chief coadjutors being that innocent Peter and that unsuspecting Mingo who had been examined and discharged nearly 3 weeks before. It is matter of demonstration that, but for the military preparations, on the appointed Sunday night, the attempt would have been made. The ringleaders had actually met for their final arrangements when, by comparing notes, they found themselves foiled, and within another week they were prisoners on trial. Nevertheless, the plot which they had laid was the most elaborate insurrectionary project ever formed by American slaves, and came the nearest to a terrible success. In boldness of conception and thoroughness of organization, there has been nothing to compare with it, and it is worthwhile to dwell somewhat upon its details, first introducing the dramatis personae. Denmark Vesey had come very near figuring as a revolutionist in Haiti instead of South Carolina. Captain Vesey, an old resident of Charleston, commanded a ship that traded between St. Thomas and Cape Francais during our Revolutionary War, in the slave transportation line. In the year 1781, he took on board a cargo of 390 slaves and sailed for the Cape. On the passage, he and his officers were much attracted by the beauty and intelligence of a boy of 14, whom they unanimously adopted into the cabin as a pet. They gave him new clothes and a new name, Telemaque, which was afterwards gradually corrupted into Telmac in Denmark. They amused themselves with him until their arrival at Cape Francais, and then, having no use for the boy, sold their pet as if he had been a macaw or a monkey. Captain Vesey sailed for St. Thomas, and, presently making another trip to Cape Francais, was surprised to hear from his consignee that Telemaque would be returned on his hands as being unsound, not in theology nor in morals, but in body, subject to epileptic fits in fact. According to the custom of that place, the boy was examined by the city physician, who required Captain Vesey to take him back, and Denmark served him faithfully, with no trouble from epilepsy, for 20 years, traveling all over the world with him and learning to speak various languages. In 1800, he drew a prize of $1,500 in the East Bay Street Lottery, with which He bought his freedom from his master for $600, much less than his market value. From that time, the official report says, he worked 29 as a carpenter. In Charleston, distinguished for physical strength and energy. Among those of his color he was looked up to with awe and respect. His temper was impetuous and domineering in the extreme, qualifying him for the despotic rule of which he was ambitious. All his passions were ungovernable and savage, and to his numerous wives and children, he displayed the haughty and capricious cruelty of an Eastern bashaw. For several years before he disclosed his intentions to anyone, he appears to have been constantly and assiduously engaged in endeavoring to embitter the minds of the colored population against the white. He rendered himself perfectly familiar with all those parts of the scriptures which he thought he could pervert to his purpose, and would readily quote them to prove that slavery was contrary to the laws of God, that slaves were bound to attempt their emancipation, however shocking and bloody might be the consequences, and that such efforts would not only be pleasing to the Almighty, but were absolutely enjoined and their success predicted. In the scriptures, his favorite texts when he addressed those of his own color were Zech, Ev, 1-3, and Josh, Vi, 21, and in all his conversations he identified their situation with that of the Israelites. The number of inflammatory pamphlets on slavery brought into Charleston from some of our sister states within the last 4 years and once from Sierra Leone, and distributed amongst the colored population of the city, for which there was a great facility in consequence of the unrestricted intercourse allowed to persons of color between the different states in the Union and the speeches in Congress of those opposed to the admission of Missouri into the Union, perhaps garbled and misrepresented, furnished him with ample means for inflaming the minds of the colored population of the state, and by distorting certain parts of those speeches, or selecting from them particular passages, he persuaded but too many that Congress had actually declared them free, and that they were held in bondage contrary to the laws of the land. Even whilst walking through the streets in company with another, he was not idle, for if his companion bowed to a white person, he would rebuke him, and observe that all men were born equal, and that he was surprised that anyone would degrade himself by such conduct, that he would never cringe to the whites, nor ought anyone who had the feelings of a man. When answered, "We are slaves," he would sarcastically and indignantly reply, "You deserve to remain slaves," and if he were further asked, "What can we do?" he would remark, "Go and buy a spelling book and read the fable of Hercules and the wagoner," which he would then repeat and apply it to their situation. He also sought every opportunity of entering into conversation with white persons when they could be overheard by Negroes nearby, especially in grog shops, during which conversation he would artfully introduce some bold remark on slavery, and sometimes, when from the character he was conversing with, he found he might still be bolder, he would go so far that, had not his declarations in such situations been clearly proved, they would scarcely have been credited. He continued this course until some time after the commencement of the last winter, by which time he had not only obtained incredible influence amongst persons of color, but many feared him more than their owners, and one of them declared, even more than his God. It was proved against him that his house had been the principal place of meeting for the conspirators, that all the others habitually referred to him as the leader, and that he had shown great address in dealing with different temperaments and overcoming a variety of scruples. One witness testified that Vesey had read to him from the Bible about the deliverance of the children of Israel, another that he had read to him a speech which had been delivered in Congress by a Mr. King on the subject of slavery, and Vesey had said that this Mr. King was the black man's friend, that he, Mr. King, had declared he would continue to speak, write, and publish pamphlets against slavery the longest day he lived, until the Southern states consented to emancipate their slaves, for that slavery was a great disgrace to the 30 country. But among all the reports there are only 2 sentences which really reveal the secret soul of Denmark Vesey and show his impulses and motives. He said he did not go with Creighton to Africa because he had not a will. He wanted to stay and see what he could do for his fellow creatures. The other takes us still nearer home. Monday Gale stated in his confession that Vesey, on first broaching the plan to him, said he was satisfied with his own condition, being free, but, as all his children were slaves, he wished to see what could be done for them. It is strange to turn from this simple statement of a perhaps intelligent preference on the part of a parent for seeing his offspring in a condition of freedom to the naive astonishment of his judges. It is difficult to imagine, says the sentence finally passed on Denmark Vesey, what Infatuation could have prompted you to attempt an enterprise so wild and visionary. You were a free man, comparatively wealthy, and enjoyed every comfort compatible with your situation. You had, therefore, much to risk and little to gain. Yet one witness testified, Vesey said the Negroes were living such an abominable life, they ought to rise. I said, I was living well, he said, though I was, others were not. And that 'twas such fools as I that were in the way and would not help them, and that after all things were well he would mark me. His general conversation, said another witness, a white boy, was about religion, which he would apply to slavery, as, for instance, he would speak of the creation of the world, in which he would say all men had equal rights, blacks as well as whites, etc. All his religious remarks were mingled with slavery, and the firmness of this purpose did not leave him, even after the betrayal of his cherished plans. After the plot was discovered, said Monday Gell, in his confession, Vesey said it was all over, unless an attempt were made to rescue those who might be condemned, by rushing on the people and saving the prisoners, or all dying together. The only person to divide with Vesey the claim of leadership was Peter Poyas. Vesey was the missionary of the cause, but Peter was the organizing mind. He kept the register of candidates and decided who should or should not be enrolled. We can't live so, he often reminded his Confederates. We must break the yoke. God has a hand in it. We have been meeting for 4 years and are not yet betrayed. Peter was a ship carpenter and a slave of great value. He was to be the military leader. His plans showed some natural generalship. He arranged the night attack. He planned the enrollment of a mounted troop to scour the streets, and he had a list of all the shops where arms and ammunition were kept for sale. He voluntarily undertook the management of the most difficult part of the enterprise, the capture of the main guardhouse, and had pledged himself to advance alone and surprise the sentinel. He was said to have a magnetism in his eyes, of which his Confederates stood in great awe. If he once got his eye upon a man, there was no resisting it. A white witness has since narrated that after his arrest, he was chained to the floor in a cell with another of the conspirators. Men in authority came and sought by promises, threats, and even tortures to ascertain the names of other accomplices. His companion, wearied out with pain and suffering, and stimulated by the hope of saving his own life, at last began to yield. Peter raised himself, leaned upon his elbow, looked at the poor fellow, saying quietly, "Die like a man," and instantly lay down again. It was enough. Not another word was extorted. One of the most notable individuals in the plot was a certain Jack Purcell, commonly called Gullah Jack, Gullah signifying Angola, the place of his origin. A conjurer by profession and by lineal heritage in his own country, he had resumed the practice of his vocation on this side, the Atlantic. For 15 years he had wielded in secret an immense influence among a sable constituency in Charleston, and as he had the reputation of being invulnerable and of teaching invulnerability as an art, he was very good at beating up recruits for insurrection. Over those of Angolese descent especially, he was a perfect king, and made them join in the '31 revolt as one man. They met him monthly at a place called Bulkley's Farm, selected because the black overseer on that plantation was one of the initiated, and because the farm was accessible by water, thus enabling them to elude the patrol. There, they prepared cartridges and pikes, and had primitive banquets, which assumed a melodramatic character under the inspiriting guidance of Jack. If a fowl was privately roasted, that mystic individual muttered incantations over it, and then they all grasped at it, exclaiming, "Thus we pull Buckra to pieces." He gave them parched corn and ground nuts to be eaten as internal safeguards on the day before the outbreak, and a consecrated kulla, or crab's claw, to be carried in the mouth by each as an amulet. These rather questionable means secured him a power which was very unquestionable. The witnesses examined in his presence all showed dread of his conjurations, and referred to him indirectly, with a kind of awe, as the little man who can't be shot. When Gullah Jack was otherwise engaged, there seems to have been a sort of deputy seer employed in the enterprise, a blind man named Philip. He was a preacher, was said to have been born with a caul on his head, and so claimed the gift of second sight. Timid adherents were brought to his house for ghostly counsel. "Why do you look so timorous?" he said to William Garner, and then quoted scripture, "Let not your heart be troubled." That a blind man should know how he looked was beyond the philosophy of the visitor, and this piece of rather cheap ingenuity carried the day. Other leaders were appointed also. Monday Gell was the scribe of the enterprise. He was a native African who had learned to read and write. He was by trade a harness maker, working chiefly on his own account. He confessed that he had written a letter to President Boyer of the new Black Republic, The letter was about the sufferings of the blacks, and to know if the people of St. Domingo would help them if they made an effort to free themselves. This epistle was sent by the black cook of a northern schooner, and the envelope was addressed to a relative of the bearer. Tom Russell was the armorer, and made pikes on a very improved model, the official report admits. Polydore Faber fitted the weapons with handles. Bacchus Hammett had charge of the firearms and ammunition, not as yet a laborious duty. William Garner and Mingo Harth were to lead the horse company. Lot Forrester was the courier, and had done, no one ever knew how much, in the way of enlisting country Negroes, of whom Ned Bennett was to take command when enlisted. Being the governor's servant, Ned was probably credited with some official experience. These were the officers, now for the plan of attack. It was the custom then, as later, for the country Negroes to flock largely into Charleston on Sunday. More than 1,000 came on ordinary occasions, and a far larger number might at any time make their appearance without exciting any suspicion. They gathered in, especially by water, from the opposite sides of Ashley and Cooper rivers, and from the neighboring islands, and they came in a great number of canoes of various sizes, many of which could carry 100 men, which were ordinarily employed in bringing agricultural products to the Charleston market. To get an approximate knowledge of the number, the city government once ordered the persons thus arriving to be counted, and that during the progress of the trials, at a time when the Negroes were rather fearful of coming into town, and it was found that, even then, there were more than 500 visitors on a single Sunday. This fact, then, was the essential point in the plan of insurrection. Whole plantations were found to have been enlisted among the candidates, as they were termed, and it was proved that the city Negroes who lived nearest the place of meeting had agreed to conceal these Confederates in their houses to a large extent on the night of the proposed outbreak. The details of the plan, however, were not rashly committed to the mass of the Confederates. They were known only to a few, and were finally to be announced only after the evening 32 prayer meetings on the appointed Sunday. But each leader had his own company enlisted, and his own work marked out. When the clock struck 12, all were to move. Peter Poyas was to lead a party ordered to assemble at South Bay, and to be joined by a force from James's Island. He was then to march up and seize the arsenal and guardhouse opposite St. Michael's Church, and detach a sufficient number to cut off all white citizens who should appear at the alarm posts. A second body of Negroes, from the country and the Neck, headed by Ned Bennett, was to assemble on the Neck and seize the arsenal there. A third was to meet at Gov. Bennett's Mills, under command of Rolla, and, after putting the governor and intendant to death, to march through the city, or be posted at Cannon's Bridge, thus preventing the inhabitants of Cannonsboro from entering the city. A fourth, partly from the country, and partly from the neighboring localities in the city, was to rendezvous on Gadsden's Wharf and attack the upper guardhouse. A fifth, composed of country and Neck Negroes, was to assemble at Bulkley's Farm, 2.5 miles from the city, seize the upper powder magazine, and then march down, and a sixth was to assemble at Denmark Vesey's and obey his orders. A seventh detachment, under Gullah Jack, was to assemble in Boundary Street at the head of King Street, to capture the arms of the Neck Company of Militia, and to take an additional supply from Mr. Dukercron's shop. The naval stores on Mee's Wharf were also to be attacked. Meanwhile, a horse company, consisting of many draymen, hostlers, and butcher boys, was to meet at Lightwood's Alley, and then scour the streets to prevent the whites from assembling. Every white man coming out of his own door was to be killed, and, if necessary, the city was to be fired in several places. Slow match for this purpose having been purloined from the public arsenal and placed in an accessible position. Beyond this, the plan of action was either unformed or undiscovered. Some slight reliance seems to have been placed on English aid, more on assistance from St. Domingo. At any rate, all the ships in the harbor were to be seized, and in these, if the worst came to the worst, those most deeply inculpated could set sail, bearing with them perhaps the spoils of shops and of banks. It seems to be admitted by the official narrative that they might have been able, at that season of the year, and with the aid of the fortifications on the Neck and around the harbor, to retain possession of the city for some time. So unsuspicious were the authorities, so unprepared the citizens, so open to attack lay the city, that nothing seemed necessary to the success of the insurgents except organization and arms. Indeed, the plan of organization easily covered a supply of arms. By their own contributions they had secured enough to strike the first blow. A few hundred pikes and daggers, together with swords and guns for the leaders. But they had carefully marked every place in the city where weapons were to be obtained. On King Street Road, beyond the municipal limits, In a common wooden shop were left unguarded the arms of the neck company of militia. To the number of several hundred stand, and these were to be secured by Bacchus Hammett, whose master kept the establishment. In Mr. Dukercron's shop there were deposited for sale as many more weapons, and they had noted Mr. Shirer's shop in Queen Street and other gunsmiths' establishments. Finally, the State Arsenal in Meeting Street, a building with no defenses, except ordinary wooden doors, was to be seized early in the outbreak. Provided, therefore, that the first moves proved successful, all the rest appeared sure. Very little seems to have been said among the conspirators in regard to any plans of riot or debauchery subsequent to the capture of the city. Either their imaginations did not dwell on them, or the witnesses did not dare to give testimony, or the authorities to print it. Death was to be dealt out, comprehensive and terrible, but nothing more is mentioned. One prisoner, Rolla, is reported in the evidence to have dropped hints in regard to the destiny of the women, 33, and there was a rumor in the newspapers of the time that he or some other of Gov. Bennett's slaves was to have taken the governor's daughter, a young girl of 16, for his wife in the event of success. But this is all. On the other hand, Denmark Vesey was known to be for a war of immediate and total extermination. And when some of the company opposed killing the ministers and the women and children, Vesey read from the scriptures that all should be cut off, and said that it was for their safety not to leave one white skin alive, for this was the plan they pursued at St. Domingo. And all this was not a mere dream of one lonely enthusiast, but a measure which had been maturing for 4 full years among several Confederates, and had been under discussion for 5 months among multitudes of initiated candidates. As usual with slave insurrections, the best men and those most trusted were deepest in the plot. Rolla was the only prominent conspirator who was not an active church member. Most of the ringleaders, says a Charleston letter writer of that day, were the rulers or class leaders in what is called the African Society, and were considered faithful, honest fellows. Indeed, many of the owners could not be convinced, till the fellows confessed themselves, that they were concerned, and that the first object of all was to kill their masters. And the first official report declares that it would not be difficult to assign a motive for the insurrectionists, if it had not been distinctly proved that, with scarcely an exception, they had no individual hardship to complain of, and were among the most humanely treated Negroes in the city. The facilities for combining and confederating in such a scheme were amply afforded by the extreme indulgence and kindness which characterized the domestic treatment of our slaves. Many slave owners among us, not satisfied with ministering to the wants of their domestics by all the comforts of abundant food and excellent clothing, with a misguided benevolence, have not only permitted their instruction, but lent to such efforts their approbation and applause. I sympathize most sincerely, says the anonymous author of a pamphlet of the period, with a very respectable and pious clergyman whose heart must still bleed at the recollection that his confidential class leader, but a week or 2 before his just conviction, had received the communion of the Lord's Supper from his hand. This wretch had been brought up in his pastor's family, and was treated with the same Christian attention as was shown to their own children. To us who are accustomed to the base and proverbial ingratitude of these people, this ill return of kindness and confidence is not surprising, but they who are ignorant of their real character will read and wonder. One demonstration of this Christian attention had lately been the closing of the African Church, of which, as has been stated, most of the leading revolutionists were members, on the ground that it tended to spread the dangerous infection of the alphabet. On January 15, 1821, the city marshal, John J. LaFar, had notified ministers of the gospel and others who keep night and Sunday schools for slaves that the education of such persons is forbidden by law, and that the city government feel imperiously bound to enforce the penalty, so that there were some special as well as general grounds for disaffection among these ungrateful favorites of fortune, the slaves. Then there were fancied dangers. An absurd report had somehow arisen, since you cannot keep men ignorant without making them unreasonable also, that on the ensuing 4th of July, the whites were to create a false alarm, and that every black man coming out was to be killed, in order to thin them, this being done to prevent their joining an imaginary army supposed to be on its way from Haiti. Others were led to suppose that Congress had ended the Missouri Compromise discussion by making them all free, and that the law would protect their liberty if they could only secure it. Others, again, were threatened with the vengeance of the conspirators unless they also joined. On the night of attack, it was said the initiated would have a countersign, and all who did not know 34 would share the fate of the whites. Add to this the reading of congressional speeches, and of the copious magazine of revolution to be found in the Bible, and it was no wonder. If they for the first time were roused under the energetic leadership of Vesey to a full consciousness of their own condition, not only were the leaders of good character and very much indulged by their owners, but this was very generally the case with all who were convicted, many of them possessing the highest confidence of their owners, and not one of bad character. In one case, it was proved that Vesey had forbidden his followers to trust a certain man because he had once been seen intoxicated. In another case, it was shown that a slave named George had made every effort to obtain their confidence, but was constantly excluded from their meetings as a talkative fellow who could not be trusted, a policy which, his levity of manner when examined in court, fully justified. They took no women into counsel, not from any distrust apparently, but in order that their children might not be left uncared for in case of defeat and destruction. House servants were rarely trusted, or only when they had been carefully sounded by the chief leaders. Peter Poyas, in commissioning an agent to enlist men, gave him excellent cautions. Don't mention it to those waiting. Men who receive presents of old coats, etc. from their masters, or they'll betray us. I will speak to them. When he did speak, if he did not convince them, he at least frightened them. But the chief reliance was on those slaves who were hired out, and therefore more uncontrolled, and also upon the country Negroes. The same far-sighted policy directed the conspirators to disarm suspicion by peculiarly obedient and orderly conduct. And it shows the precaution with which the thing was carried on that, although Peter Poyas was proved to have had a list of some 600 persons, yet not one of his particular company was ever brought to trial, as each leader kept to himself the names of his proselytes, and as Monday Gell was the only one of these leaders who turned traitor. Any opinion as to the numbers actually engaged must be altogether conjectural. One witness said 9,000, another 6,600. These statements were probably extravagant, though not more so than Gov. Bennett's assertion, on the other side, that all who were actually concerned had been brought to justice, unless by this phrase he designates only the ringleaders. The avowed aim of the governor's letter, indeed, is to smooth the thing over for the credit and safety of the city, and its evasive tone contrasts strongly with the more frank and thorough statements of the judges, made after the thing could no longer be hushed up. These high authorities explicitly acknowledged that they had failed to detect more than a small minority of those concerned in the project, and seemed to admit that if it had once been brought to a head, the slaves generally would have joined in. We cannot venture to say, says the intendant's pamphlet, to how many the knowledge of the intended effort was communicated, who without signifying their assent or attending any of the meetings were yet prepared to profit by events, that there are many who would not have permitted the enterprise to have failed at a critical moment for the want of their CO operation. We have the best reason for believing. So believed the community at large, and the panic was in proportion. When the whole danger was finally made public, the scenes I witnessed, says one who has since narrated the circumstances, and the declaration of the impending danger that met us at all times, and on all occasions, forced the conviction that never were an entire people more thoroughly alarmed than were the people of Charleston at that time. During the excitement and the trial of the supposed conspirators, rumor proclaimed all, and doubtless more than all, the horrors of the plot. The city was to be fired in every quarter. The arsenal in the immediate vicinity was to be broken open, and the arms distributed to the insurgents, and a universal massacre of the white inhabitants to take place. Nor did there seem to be any doubt in the mind of the people that such would actually have been the result, had not the plot fortunately been detected before the time appointed for the '35 outbreak. It was believed, as a matter of course, that every black in the city would join in the insurrection, and that if the original design had been attempted, and the city taken by surprise, the Negroes would have achieved a complete and easy victory. Nor does it seem at all impossible that such might have been, or yet may be, the case if any well-arranged and resolute rising should take place. Indeed, this universal admission that all the slaves were ready to take part in any desperate enterprise was one of the most startling aspects of the affair. The authorities say that the two principal states' evidence declared that they never spoke to any person of color on the subject, or knew of any one who had been spoken to by the other leaders who had withheld his assent, and the conspirators seem to have been perfectly satisfied that all the remaining slaves would enter their ranks upon the slightest success. Let us assemble a sufficient number to commence the work with spirit, and we'll not want men. They'll fall in behind us fast enough. And as an illustration of this readiness, the official report mentions a slave who had belonged to one master for 16 years, sustaining a high character for fidelity and affection, who had twice traveled with him through the northern states, resisting every solicitation to escape, and who yet was very deeply concerned in the insurrection, though knowing it to involve the probable destruction of the whole family with whom he lived. One singular circumstance followed the first rumors of the plot. Several white men, said to be of low and unprincipled character, at once began to make interest with the supposed leaders among the slaves, either from genuine sympathy or with the intention of betraying them, for money or by profiting by the insurrection, should it succeed. 4 of these were brought to trial, but the official report expresses the opinion that many more might have been discovered but for the inadmissibility of slave testimony against whites. Indeed, the evidence against even these 4 was insufficient for a capital conviction, although one was overheard through stratagem by the intendant himself and arrested on the spot. This man was a Scotchman, another a Spaniard, a third a German, and the 4th a Carolinian. The last had for 30 years kept a shop in the neighborhood of Charleston. He was proved to have asserted that the Negroes had as much right to fight for their liberty as the white people, had offered to head them in the enterprise, and had said that in 3 weeks he would have 2,000 men. But in no case, it appears, did these men obtain the confidence of the slaves, and the whole plot was conceived and organized, so far as appears, without the slightest cooperation from any white man. The trial of the conspirators began on Wednesday, June 19th. At the request of the intendant, Justices Kennedy and Parker summoned 5 freeholders, Messrs. Drayton, Hayward, Pringle, Legara, and Turnbull, to constitute a court, under the provisions of the Act, for the better ordering and governing Negroes and other slaves. The intendant laid the case before them, with a list of prisoners and witnesses. By a vote of the court, all spectators were excluded, except the owners and counsel of the slaves concerned. No other colored person was allowed to enter the jail, and a strong guard of soldiers was kept always on duty around the building. Under these general arrangements, the trials proceeded with elaborate formality, though with some variations from ordinary usage, as was indeed required by the statute. For instance, the law provided that the testimony of any Indian or slave could be received, without oath, against a slave or free colored person, although it was not valid, even under oath, against a white. But it is best to quote the official language in respect to the rules adopted, as the court had been organized under a statute of a peculiar and local character, and intended for the government of a distinct class of persons in the community. They were bound to conform their proceedings to its provisions, which depart in many essential features from the principles of the common law and some of the settled rules of evidence. The court, 36, however, determined to adopt those rules whenever they were not repugnant to nor expressly accepted by that statute, nor inconsistent with the local situation and policy of the state, and laid down for their own government the following regulations. First, that no slave should be tried except in the presence of his owner or his counsel, and that notice should be given in every case at least 1 day before the trial. Second, that the testimony of one witness, unsupported by additional evidence or by circumstances, should lead to no conviction of a capital nature. Third, that the witnesses should be confronted with the accused and with each other in every case, except where testimony was given, under a solemn pledge that the names of the witnesses should not be divulged, as they declared in some instances that they apprehended being murdered by the blacks, if it was known that they had volunteered their evidence. Fourth, that the prisoners might be represented by counsel whenever this was requested, by the owners of the slaves or by the prisoners themselves if free. Fifth, that the statements or defenses of the accused should be heard in every case, and they be permitted themselves to examine any witness they thought proper. It is singular to observe how entirely these rules seem to concede that a slave's life has no sort of value to himself, but only to his master. His master, not he himself, must choose whether it be worthwhile to employ counsel. His master, not his mother or his wife, must be present at the trial. So far is this carried, that the provision to exclude persons who had no particular interest in the slaves accused seems to have excluded every acknowledged relative they had in the world, and admitted only those who had invested in them so many dollars. And yet the very first section of that part of the statute under which they were tried lays down an explicit recognition of their humanity, and whereas natural justice forbids that any person of what condition soever should be condemned unheard, so thoroughly, in the whole report, are the ideas of person and chattel intermingled, that when Gov. Bennett petitions for mitigation of sentence in the case of his slave Bateau, and closes, "I ask this, gentlemen, as an individual incurring a severe and distressing loss, it is Really impossible to decide whether the predominant emotion be affectional or financial. It is a matter of painful necessity to acknowledge that the proceedings of most slave tribunals have justified the honest admission of Gov. Adams of South Carolina in his legislative message of 1855, the administration of our laws in relation to our colored population by our courts of magistrates and freeholders, as these courts are at present constituted, calls loudly for reform. Their decisions are rarely in conformity with justice or humanity. This trial, as reported by the justices themselves, seems to have been no worse than the average, perhaps better. In all, 35 were sentenced to death, 34 to transportation, 27 acquitted by the court, and 25 discharged without trial by the Committee of Vigilance, making in all 121 the sentences pronounced by Judge Kennedy upon the leading rebels, while paying a high tribute to their previous character, of course bring all law and all scripture to prove the magnitude of their crime. It is a melancholy fact, he says, that those servants in whom we repose the most unlimited confidence have been the principal actors in this wicked scheme. Then he rises into earnest appeals. Are you incapable of the heavenly influence of that gospel, all whose paths are peace? It was to reconcile us to our destiny on earth and to enable us to discharge with fidelity all our duties, whether as master or servant, that those inspired precepts were imparted by heaven to fallen man. To these reasonings the prisoners had, of course, nothing to say, but the official reports bear the strongest testimony to their fortitude. Rolla, when arraigned, affected not to understand the charge against him, and, when it was at his request further explained to him, assumed with wonderful adroitness, astonishment, and surprise. He was remarkable, throughout his 37 trial, for great presence and composure of mind. When he was informed he was convicted, and was advised to prepare for death, though he had previously, but, after his trial confessed his guilt, he appeared perfectly confounded, but exhibited no signs of fear. In Ned's behavior there was nothing remarkable, but his countenance was stern and immovable, even whilst he was receiving the sentence of death. From his looks it was impossible to discover or conjecture what were his feelings. Not so with Peter, for in his countenance were strongly marked disappointed ambition, revenge, indignation, and an anxiety to know how far the discoveries had extended, and the same emotions were exhibited in his conduct. He did not appear to fear personal consequences, for his whole behavior indicated the reverse, but exhibited an evident anxiety for the success of their plan, in which his whole soul was embarked. His countenance and behavior were the same when he received his sentence, and his only words were, on retiring, "I suppose you'll let me see my wife and family before I die," and that not in a supplicating tone. When he was asked, a day or two after, if it was possible he could wish to see his master and family murdered, who had treated him so kindly, he only replied to the question by a smile. Monday's behavior was not peculiar. When he was before the court, his arms were folded. He heard the testimony given against him and received his sentence with the utmost firmness and composure. But no description can accurately convey to others the impression which the trial, defense, and appearance of Gullah Jack made on those who witnessed the workings of his cunning and rude address. When arrested and brought before the court, in company with another African, named Jack, the property of the estate of Pritchard, he assumed so much ignorance and looked and acted the fool so well that some of the court could not believe that this was the necromancer who was sought after. This conduct he continued when on his trial, until he saw the witnesses and heard the testimony as it progressed against him, when in an instant his countenance was lighted up as if by lightning, and his wildness and vehemence of gesture, and the malignant glance with which he eyed the witnesses who appeared against him, all indicated the savage, who indeed had been caught, but not tamed. His courage, however, soon forsook him. When he received sentence of death, he earnestly implored that a fortnight longer might be allowed him, and then a week longer, which he continued earnestly to solicit until he was taken from the courtroom to his cell, and when he was carried to execution, he gave up his spirit without firmness or composure. Not so with Denmark Vesey. The plans of years were frustrated, his own life and liberty were thrown away, many others were sacrificed through his leadership, and one more was added to the list of unsuccessful insurrections. All these disastrous certainties he faced calmly, and gave his whole mind composedly to the conducting of his defense. With his arms tightly folded and his eyes fixed on the floor, he attentively followed every item of the testimony. He heard the witnesses examined by the court and cross-examined by his own counsel, and it is evident from the narrative of the presiding judge that he showed no small skill and policy in the searching cross-examination which he then applied. The fears, the feelings, the consciences of those who had betrayed him, all were in turn appealed to, but the facts were quite overpowering, and it was too late to aid his comrades or himself. Then turning to the court, he skillfully availed himself of the point which had so much impressed the community, the intrinsic improbability that a man in his position of freedom and prosperity should sacrifice everything to free other people. If they thought it so incredible, why not give him the benefit of the incredibility? The act being, as they stated, one of infatuation, why convict him of it on the bare word of men, who by their own showing had not only shared the infatuation, but proved traitors to it? An ingenious defense, indeed the only one which could by any possibility be suggested, anterior to the days of Choate and somnambulism, but in vain. He was sentenced, and it was not apparently till the judge reproached him for the 38 destruction he had brought on his followers that he showed any sign of emotion. Then the tears came into his eyes, but he said not another word. The executions took place on 5 different days, and bad as they were, they might have been worse. After the imaginary Negro plot of New York in 1741, 13 Negroes had been judicially burned alive. 2 had suffered the same sentence. At Charleston in 1808, and it was undoubtedly some mark of progress that in this case the gallows took the place of the flames. 6 were hanged on July 2nd upon Blake's lands near Charleston. Denmark Vesey, Peter Poyas, Jesse, Ned, Rolla, and Bateau, the last 3 being slaves of the governor himself. Gullah Jack and John were executed on the lines near Charleston on July 12 and 22 more on July 26. 4 others suffered their fate on July 30, and 1 more, William Garner, effected a temporary escape, was captured and tried by a different court, and was finally executed on August 9. The self-control of these men did not desert them at their execution. When the 6 leaders suffered death, the report says, Peter Poyas repeated his charge of secrecy. Do not open your lips, die silent, as you shall see me do, and all obeyed. And though afterwards, as the particulars of the plot became better known, there was less inducement to conceal, yet every one of the 35 seems to have met his fate bravely, except the conjurer. Gov. Bennett, in his letter, expresses much dissatisfaction at the small amount learned from the participators, to the last hour of the existence of several who appeared to be conspicuous actors in the drama. They were pressingly importuned to make further confessions, this importuning being more clearly defined in a letter of Mr. Ferguson, owner of 2 of the slaves, as having them severely corrected. Yet so little was obtained that the governor was compelled to admit at last that the really essential features of the plot were not known to any of the informers. It is to be remembered that the plot failed because a man unauthorized and incompetent, William Paul, undertook to make enlistments on his own account. He happened on one of precisely that class of men, favored house servants, whom his leaders had expressly reserved for more skillful manipulations. He being thus detected, one would have supposed that the discovery of many accomplices would at once have followed. The number enlisted was counted by thousands, yet for 29 days after the first treachery, and during 20 days of official examination, only 15 of the conspirators were ferreted out. Meanwhile, the informers' names had to be concealed with the utmost secrecy. They were in peril of their lives from the slaves. William Paul scarcely dared to go beyond the doorstep, and the names of important witnesses examined in June were still suppressed, and the official report published in October that a conspiracy on so large a scale should have existed in embryo during 4 years, and in an active form for several months, and yet have been so well managed that after actual betrayal, the authorities were again thrown off their guard and the plot nearly brought to a head again. This certainly shows extraordinary ability in the leaders, and a talent for concerted action on the part of slaves generally, with which they have hardly been credited. And it is also to be noted that the range of the conspiracy extended far beyond Charleston. It was proved that Frank, slave of Mr. Ferguson, living nearly 40 miles from the city, had boasted of having enlisted 4 plantations in his immediate neighborhood. It was in evidence that the insurgents were trying all round the country, from Georgetown and Santee roundabout to Combahee, to get people, and after the trials, it was satisfactorily established that Vesey had been in the country as far north as South Santee, and southwardly, as far as the Yuhas, which is between 70 and 80 miles from the city. Mr. Ferguson himself testified that the good order of any gang was no evidence of their ignorance of the plot, since The behavior of his own initiated slaves had been unexceptionable in accordance with Vesey's directions. With such an organization and such materials, there was nothing in the plan which could be pronounced incredible or impracticable. There is no reason why they should not have taken the city. After all the governor's entreaties as to moderate language, the authorities were obliged to admit that South Carolina had been saved from a horrible catastrophe. For, although success could not possibly have attended the conspirators, yet before their suppression, Charleston would probably have been wrapped in flames, many valuable lives would have been sacrificed, and an immense loss of property sustained by the citizens, even though no other distressing occurrences were experienced by them, while the plantations in the lower country would have been disorganized, and the agricultural interests have sustained an enormous loss. The Northern journals had already expressed still greater anxieties. It appears, said the New York Commercial Advertiser, that, but for the timely disclosure, the whole of that state would in a few days have witnessed the horrid spectacle once witnessed in St. Domingo. My friend, David Lee Child, has kindly communicated to me a few memoranda of a conversation held long since with a free-colored man who had worked in Vesey's shop during the time of the insurrection, and these generally confirmed the official narratives. I was a young man then, he said, and owing to the policy of preventing communication between free-colored people and slaves, I had little opportunity of ascertaining how the slaves felt about it. I know that several of them were abused in the street and some put in prison for appearing in sackcloth. There was an ordinance of the city that any slave who wore a badge of mourning should be imprisoned and flogged. They generally got the law, which is 39 lashes, but sometimes it was according to the decision of the court. I heard, at the time, of arms being buried in coffins at Sullivan's Island. In the time of the insurrection, the slaves were tried in a small room in the jail where they were confined. No colored person was allowed to go within 2 squares of the prison. Those 2 squares were filled with troops, 5,000 of whom were on duty day and night. I was told, Vesey said to those that tried him, that the work of insurrection would go on, but, as none but white persons were permitted to be present, I cannot tell whether he said it. During all this time there was naturally a silence in the Charleston journals, which strongly contrasts with the extreme publicity at last given to the testimony. Even the National Intelligencer, at Washington, passed lightly over the affair and deprecated the publication of particulars. The Northern editors, on the other hand, eager for items, were constantly complaining of this reserve and calling for further intelligence. The Charleston papers, said the Hartford Courant of July 16th, have been silent on the subject of the insurrection, but letters from this city state that it has created much alarm and that 2 brigades of troops were under arms for some time to suppress any risings that might have taken place. You will doubtless hear, wrote a Charleston correspondent of the same paper, just before many reports, and some exaggerated ones. There was certainly a disposition to revolt and some preparations made, principally by the plantation Negroes, to take the city. We hoped they would progress so far as to enable us to ascertain and punish the ringleaders. Assure my friends that we feel in perfect security, although the number of nightly guards and other demonstrations may induce a belief among strangers to the contrary. The strangers would have been very blind strangers if they had not been more influenced by the actions of the Charleston citizens than by their words. The original information was given on May 25, 1822. The time passed, and the plot failed on June 16. A plan for its revival on July 2 proved abortive. Yet a letter from Charleston, in the Hartford Courant of August 640, represented the panic as unabated. Great preparations are making, and all the military are put in preparation to guard against any attempt of the same kind again, but we have no apprehension of its being repeated. On August 10, Gov. Bennett wrote the letter already mentioned, which was printed and distributed as a circular, its object being to deprecate undue alarm. Every individual in the state is interested, whether in regard to his own property or the reputation of the state, in giving no more importance to the transaction than it justly merits. Yet, 5 days after this, 2 months after the first danger had passed, a reinforcement of United States troops arrived at Fort Moultrie, and during the same month, several different attempts were made by small parties of armed Negroes to capture the mails between Charleston and Savannah, and a reward of $200 was offered for their detection. The first official report of the trials was prepared by the intendant by request of the city council. It passed through 4 editions in a few months, the first and fourth being published in Charleston and the second and third in Boston. Being, however, but a brief pamphlet, it did not satisfy the public curiosity, and in October of the same year, 1822, a larger volume appeared at Charleston, edited by the magistrates, who presided at the trials, Lionel H. Kennedy and Thomas Parker. It contains the evidence in full and a separate narrative of the whole affair, more candid and lucid than any other which I have found in the newspapers or pamphlets of the day. It exhibits that rarest of all qualities in a slave community, a willingness to look facts in the face. This narrative has been faithfully followed, with the aid of such cross-lights as could be secured from many other quarters, in preparing the present history. The editor of the first official report racked his brains to discover the special causes of the revolt and never trusted himself to allude to the general one. The Negroes rebelled because they were deluded by congressional eloquence, or because they were excited by a church squabble, or because they had been spoilt by mistaken indulgences, such as being allowed to learn to read, a misguided benevolence as he pronounces it. So the Baptist Convention seems to have thought it was because they were not Baptists, and an Episcopal pamphleteer because they were not Episcopalians. It never seems to occur to any of these spectators that these people rebelled simply because they were slaves and wished to be free. No doubt there were enough special torches with which a man so skillful as Denmark Vesey could kindle up these dusky powder magazines, but after all, the permanent peril lay in the powder. So long as that existed, everything was incendiary. Any torn scrap in the street might contain a Missouri Compromise speech or a report of the last battle in St. Domingo, or one of those able letters of Boyer's which were winning the praise of all, or one of John Randolph's stirring speeches in England against the slave trade. The very newspapers which reported the happy extinction of the insurrection by the hanging of the last conspirator, William Garner, reported also, with enthusiastic indignation, the massacre of the Greeks at Constantinople and at Cio. And then the Northern editors, breaking from their usual reticence, pointed out the inconsistency of Southern journals. In printing, side by side, denunciations of Mohammedan slave sales and advertisements of those of Christians. Of course, the insurrection threw the whole slavery question open to the public. We are sorry to see, said the National Intelligencer of August 31, that a discussion of the hateful Missouri question is likely to be revived in consequence of the allusions to its supposed effect in producing the late servile insurrection in South Carolina. A member of the Board of Public Works of South Carolina published in The Baltimore American Farmer an essay urging the encouragement of white laborers and hinting at the ultimate abolition of slavery if it should ever be thought desirable. More boldly still, a pamphlet appeared in Charleston, under the 41 signature of a Chates, arguing with remarkable sagacity and force against the whole system of slave labor in towns, and proposing that all slaves in Charleston should be sold, or transferred to the plantations and their places supplied by white labor. It is interesting to find many of the facts and arguments of Helper's impending crisis anticipated in this courageous tract, written under the pressure of a crisis which had just been so narrowly evaded. The author is described in the preface as a soldier and patriot of the Revolution, whose name did we feel ourselves at liberty to use it, would stamp a peculiar weight and value on his opinions. It was commonly attributed to General Thomas Pinckney. Another pamphlet of the period, also published in Charleston, recommended as a practical cure for insurrection the copious administration of Episcopal church services and the prohibition of Negroes from attending 4th of July celebrations. On this last point, it is more consistent than most pro-slavery arguments. The celebration of the 4th of July belongs exclusively to the white population of the United States. The American Revolution was a family quarrel among equals. In this the Negroes had no concern. Their condition remained, and must remain, unchanged. They have no more to do with the celebration of that day than with the landing of the Pilgrims on the rock at Plymouth. It therefore seems to me improper to allow these people to be present on these occasions. In our speeches and orations, much, and sometimes more than is politically necessary, is said about personal liberty, which Negro auditors know not how to apply, except by running the parallel with their own condition. They therefore imbibe false notions of their own personal rights, and give reality in their minds to what has no real existence. The peculiar state of our community must be steadily kept in view. This, I am gratified to learn, will in some measure be promoted by the institution of the South Carolina Association. On the other hand, more stringent laws became obviously necessary. To keep down the advancing intelligence of the Charleston slaves, dangerous knowledge must be excluded from without and from within. For the first purpose, the South Carolina legislature passed, in December 1822, the Act for the Imprisonment of Northern Colored Seamen, which afterwards produced so much excitement. For the second object, the grand jury, about the same time, presented as a grievance the number of schools which are kept within the city by persons of color, and proposed their prohibition. This was the encouragement given to the intellectual progress of the slaves, while, as a reward for betraying them, Pencil, the free colored man who advised with Devaney, received a present of $1,000, and Devaney himself had what was rightly judged to be the higher gift of freedom, and was established in business with liberal means as a drayman. He lived long in Charleston, thriving greatly in his vocation, and, according to the newspapers, enjoyed the privilege of being the only man of property in the state whom a special statute exempted from taxation. More than half a century has passed since the incidents of this true story closed. It has not vanished from the memories of South Carolinians, though the printed pages which once told it have gradually disappeared from sight. The intense avidity which at first grasped at every incident of the great insurrectionary plot was succeeded by a prolonged distaste for the memory of the tale and the official reports which told what slaves had once planned and dared have now come to be among the rarest of American historical documents. In 1841, a friend of the writer, then visiting South Carolina, heard from her hostess for the first time the events which are recounted here. On asking to see the reports of the trials, she was cautiously told that the only copy in the house, after being carefully kept for years under lock and key, had been burnt at last, lest it should reach the dangerous eyes of the slaves. The same thing had happened, it was added, in many other families. This partially accounts for the great difficulty now to be found in obtaining a single copy of either publication, and this 42 is why, to the readers of American history, Denmark Vesey and Peter Poyas have commonly been but the shadows of names. Nat Turner's insurrection during the year 1831. Up to the 23d of August, the Virginia newspapers seem to have been absorbed in the momentous problems which then occupied the minds of intelligent American citizens. What General Jackson should do with the scolds, and what with the disreputables. Should South Carolina be allowed to nullify? And would the wives of cabinet ministers call on Mrs. Eaton? It is an unfailing opiate to turn over the drowsy files of the Richmond Enquirer, until the moment when those dry and dusty pages are suddenly kindled into flame by the torch of Nat Turner. Then the terror flared on increasing, until the remotest southern states were found shuddering at nightly rumors of insurrection, until far-off European colonies, Antigua, Martinique, Caracas, Tortola, recognized by some secret sympathy the same epidemic alarms, until the very boldest words of freedom were reported as uttered in the Virginia House of Delegates with unclosed doors, until an obscure young man named Garrison was indicted at common law in North Carolina and had a price set upon his head by the legislature of Georgia. Near the southeastern border of Virginia in Southampton County, there is a neighborhood known as the Cross Keys. It lies 15 miles from Jerusalem, the county town or courthouse, 70 miles from Norfolk, and about as far from Richmond. It is some 10 or 15 miles from Murfreesboro in North Carolina, and about 25 from the Great Dismal Swamp. Up to Sunday, the August 21st, 1831, there was nothing to distinguish it from any other rural, lethargic, slipshod Virginia neighborhood with the due allotment of mansion houses and log huts, tobacco fields and old fields, horses, dogs, Negroes, poor white folks so-called, and other white folks, poor without being called so. One of these last was Joseph Travis, who had recently married the widow of one Putnam Moore, and had unfortunately wedded to himself her Negroes also. In the woods on the plantation of Joseph Travis upon the Sunday just named 6 slaves met at noon for what is called in the northern states a picnic, and in the southern a barbecue. The bill of fare was to be simple. One brought a pig, and another some brandy, giving to the meeting an aspect so cheaply convivial that no one would have imagined it to be the final consummation of a conspiracy which had been for 6 months in preparation. In this plot, 4 of the men had been already initiated: Henry, Hark or Hercules, Nelson and Sam. 2 others were novices, Will and Jack by name. The party had remained together from 12 to 3 o'clock, when a 7th man joined them, a short, stout, powerfully built person, of dark mulatto complexion, and strongly marked African features, but with a face full of expression and resolution. This was Nat Turner. He was at this time nearly 31 years old, having been born on the 2d of October, 1800. He had belonged originally to Benjamin Turner, from whom he took his last name, slaves having usually no patronymic, had then been transferred to Putnam Moore, and then to his present owner. He had, by his own account, felt himself singled out from childhood for some great work, and he had some peculiar marks on his person which, joined to his mental precocity, were enough to occasion, among his youthful companions, a superstitious faith in his gifts and destiny. He had some mechanical ingenuity also, experimentalized very early in making paper, gunpowder, pottery, and in other arts, which in later life he was found thoroughly to understand. His moral faculties appeared strong, so that white witnesses admitted that he had never been known to swear an oath, to drink a drop of spirits, or to commit a theft. And in general, so marked were his early peculiarities that people said he had too much sense to be raised, and if he was, he would never be of any use as a slave. This impression of personal destiny grew with his growth. He fasted, prayed, preached, read the Bible, heard voices when he walked behind his plow, and communicated his revelations to the awe-struck slaves. They told him in return that if they had his sense, they would not serve any master in the world. The biographies of slaves can hardly be individualized. They belong to the class. We know bare facts. It is only the general experience of human beings in like condition which can clothe them with life. The outlines are certain. The details are inferential. Thus, for instance, we know that Nat Turner's young wife was a slave. We know that she belonged to a different master from himself. We know little more than this. But this is much, for this is equivalent to saying that by day or by night, her husband had no more power to protect her than the man who lies bound upon a plundered vessel's deck has power to protect his wife on board the pirate schooner disappearing in the horizon. She may be well treated. She may be outraged. It is in the powerlessness that the agony lies. There is indeed one thing more which we do know of this young woman. The Virginia newspapers state that she was tortured under the lash after her husband's execution to make her produce his papers. This is all what his private experiences and special privileges or wrongs may have been. It is therefore now impossible to say. Travis was declared to be more humane and fatherly to his slaves than any man in the county. But it is astonishing how often this phenomenon occurs in the contemporary annals of slave insurrections. The chairman of the county court also stated, in pronouncing sentence, that Nat Turner had spoken of his master as only too indulgent, but this, for some reason, does not appear in his printed confession, which only says, "He was a kind master, and placed the greatest confidence in me." It is very possible that it may have been so, but the printed accounts of Nat Turner's person look suspicious. He is described in Gov. Floyd's proclamation as having a scar on one of his temples, also one on the back of his neck, and a large knot on one of the bones of his right arm, produced by a blow. And although these were explained away in Virginia newspapers as having been produced by fights with his companions, yet such a phrase are entirely foreign to the admitted habits of the man. It must therefore remain an open question whether the scars and the knot were produced by black hands or by white. Whatever Nat Turner's experiences of slavery might have been, it is certain that his plans were not suddenly adopted, but that he had brooded over them for years. To this day there are traditions among the Virginia slaves of the keen devices of Prophet Nat's. If he was caught with lime and lampblack in hand, conning over a half-finished county map on the barn door, he was always planning what to do if he were blind, or studying how to get to Mr. Francis's house. When he had called a meeting of slaves, and some poor whites came eavesdropping, the poor whites at once became the subjects for discussion. He incidentally mentioned that the masters had been heard threatening to drive them away. One slave had been ordered to shoot Mr. Jones's pigs, another to tear down Mr. Johnson's fences. The poor whites, Johnson and Jones, ran home to see to their homesteads, and were better friends than ever to Prophet Nat. He never was a Baptist preacher, though such vocation has often been attributed to him. The impression arose from his having immersed himself during one of his periods of special enthusiasm, together with a poor white man named Brantley. About this time, he says in his confession, "I told these things to a white man, on whom it had a wonderful effect, and he ceased from his wickedness, and was attacked immediately with a cutaneous eruption, and the blood oozed from the pores of his skin, and after praying and fasting 9 days he was healed. And the Spirit appeared to me again, and said, as the Savior had been baptized, so should we be also. And when the white people would not let us be baptized by the church, we 45 went down into the water together, in the sight of many who reviled us, and were baptized by the Spirit. After this I rejoiced greatly, and gave thanks to God." The religious hallucinations narrated in his confession seem to have been as genuine as the average of such things, and are very well expressed. The account reads quite like Jacob Behmen. He saw white spirits and black spirits contending in the skies. The sun was darkened, the thunder rolled, and the Holy Ghost was with me, and said, Behold me, as I stand in the heavens. And I looked, and saw the forms of men in different attitudes. And there were lights in the sky, to which the children of darkness gave other names than what they really were, for they were the lights of the Savior's hands stretched forth from east to west, even as they were extended on the cross on Calvary for the redemption of sinners. He saw drops of blood on the corn. This was Christ's blood, shed for man. He saw on the leaves in the woods letters and numbers and figures of men, the same symbols which he had seen in the skies. On May 12, 1828, the Holy Spirit appeared to him and proclaimed that the yoke of Jesus must fall on him, and he must fight against the serpent when the sign appeared. Then came an eclipse of the sun in February 1831. This was the sign. Then he must arise and prepare himself and slay his enemies with their own weapons. Then also the seal was removed from his lips, and then he confided his plans to 4 associates. When he came therefore to the barbecue on the appointed Sunday, and found not these 4, only but 2 others, his first question to the intruders was, how they came thither. To this Will answered manfully that his life was worth no more than the others, and his liberty was as dear to him. This admitted him to confidence, and as Jack was known to be entirely under Hark's influence, the strangers were no bar to their discussion. 11 hours they remained there, in anxious consultation. One can imagine those dusky faces, beneath the funereal woods, and amid the flickering of pine-knot torches, preparing that stern revenge whose shuddering echoes should ring through the land so long. 2 things were at last decided: to begin their work that night, and to begin it with a massacre so swift and irresistible as to create in a few days more terror than many battles, and so spare the need of future bloodshed. It was agreed that we should commence at home on that night, and until we had armed and equipped ourselves, and gained sufficient force, neither age nor sex was to be spared, which was invariably adhered to. John Brown invaded Virginia with 19 men, and with the avowed resolution to take no life but in self-defense. Nat Turner attacked Virginia from within, with 6 men, and with the determination to spare no life until his power was established. John Brown intended to pass rapidly through Virginia, and then retreat to the mountains. Nat Turner intended to conquer Southampton County as the white men did in the Revolution, and then retreat, if necessary, to the Dismal Swamp. Each plan was deliberately matured, each was in its way practicable, but each was defeated by a single false step, as will soon appear. We must pass over the details of horror, as they occurred during the next 24 hours. Swift and stealthy as Indians, the black men passed from house to house, not pausing, not hesitating, as their terrible work went on. In one thing they were humaner than Indians, or than white men fighting against Indians. There was no gratuitous outrage beyond the death blow itself, no insult, no mutilation, but in every house they entered, that blow fell. On man, woman, and child, nothing that had a white skin was spared. From every house they took arms and ammunition, and from a few money. On every plantation they found recruits, those dusky slaves, so obsequious to their master the day before, so prompt to sing and dance before his northern visitors were, all swift to transform themselves into fiends of retribution now. Show them sword or musket, and they grasped it, though it were an heirloom from Washington himself. The troop increased from house to house, first to 15, then to 40, 46, then to 60. Some were armed with muskets, some with axes, some with scythes, some came on their masters' horses. As the numbers increased, they could be divided, and the awful work was carried on more rapidly still. The plan then was for an advanced guard of horsemen to approach each house at a gallop, and surround it till the others came up. Meanwhile, what agonies of terror must have taken place within, shared alike by innocent and by guilty. What memories of wrongs inflicted on those dusky creatures by some, what innocent participation by others in the penance. The outbreak lasted for but 48 hours, but during that period, 55 whites were slain, without the loss of a single slave. One fear was needless, which to many a husband and father must have intensified the last struggle. These Negroes had been systematically brutalized from childhood. They had been allowed no legalized or permanent marriage. They had beheld around them an habitual licentiousness such as can scarcely exist except under slavery. Some of them had seen their wives and sisters habitually polluted by the husbands and the brothers of these fair white women, who were now absolutely in their power. Yet I have looked through the Virginia newspapers of that time in vain for one charge. of an indecent outrage on a woman against these triumphant and terrible slaves. Wherever they went, there went death, and that was all. It is reported by some of the contemporary newspapers that a portion of this abstinence was the result of deliberate consultation among the insurrectionists, that some of them were resolved on taking the white women for wives, but were overruled by Nat Turner. If so, he is the only American slave leader of whom we know certainly that he rose above the ordinary level of slave vengeance, and Mrs. Stowe's picture of Dred's purposes is then precisely typical of his, whom the Lord saith unto us, smite, them will we smite. We will not torment them with the scourge and fire, nor defile their women as they have done with ours, but we will slay them utterly, and consume them from off the face of the earth. When the number of adherents had increased to 50 or 60, Nat Turner judged it time to strike at the county seat, Jerusalem. Thither a few white fugitives had already fled, and couriers might thence be dispatched for aid to Richmond and Petersburg, unless promptly intercepted. Besides, he could there find arms, ammunition, and money, though they had already obtained, it is dubiously reported, from $800 to $1,000. On the way, it was necessary to pass the plantation of Mr. Parker, 3 miles from Jerusalem. Some of the men wished to stop here and enlist some of their friends. Nat Turner objected, as the delay might prove dangerous. He yielded at last, and it proved fatal. He remained at the gate with 6 or 8 men. 30 or 40 went to the house, half a mile distant. They remained too long, and he went alone to hasten them. During his absence, a party of 18 white men came up suddenly, dispersing the small guard left at the gate, and, when the main body of slaves emerged from the house, they encountered, for the first time, their armed masters. The blacks halted. The whites advanced cautiously within 100 yards, and fired a volley on its being. Returned, they broke into disorder and hurriedly retreated, leaving some wounded on the ground. The retreating whites were pursued, and were saved only by falling in with another band of fresh men from Jerusalem, with whose aid they turned upon the slaves, who in their turn fell into confusion. Turner, Hark, and about 20 men on horseback retreated in some order. The rest were scattered. The leader still planned to reach Jerusalem by a private way, thus evading pursuit, but at last decided to stop for the night, in the hope of enlisting additional recruits. During the night, the number increased again to 40, and they encamped on Major Ridley's plantation. An alarm took place during the darkness, whether real or imaginary does not appear, and the men became scattered again. Proceeding to make fresh enlistments with the daylight, they were resisted at Dr. Blunt's house, where his slaves, under his orders, fired 47 upon them, and this, with a later attack from a party of white men near Captain Harris's, so broke up the whole force that they never reunited. The few who remained together agreed to separate for a few hours, to see if anything could be done to revive the insurrection, and meet again that evening at their original rendezvous. But they never reached it. Gloomily came Nat Turner at nightfall into those gloomy woods where 48 hours before he had revealed the details of his terrible plot to his companions. At the outset, all his plans had succeeded. Everything was as he predicted. The slaves had come readily at his call. The masters had proved perfectly defenseless. Had he not been persuaded to pause at Parker's plantation, he would have been master before now of the arms and ammunition at Jerusalem. And with these to aid, and the dismal swamp for a refuge, he might have sustained himself indefinitely against his pursuers. Now the blood was shed, the risk was incurred, his friends were killed or captured, and all for what? Lasting memories of terror, to be sure, for his oppressors, but on the other hand, hopeless failure for the insurrection, and certain death for him. What a watch he must have kept that night! To that excited imagination, which had always seen spirits in the sky, and blood drops on the corn and hieroglyphic marks on the dry leaves, how full the lonely forest must have been of signs and solemn warnings, alone with the fox's bark, the rabbit's rustle, and the screech owl scream. The self-appointed prophet brooded over his despair. Once creeping to the edge of the wood, he saw men stealthily approach on horseback. He fancied them some of his companions, but before he dared to whisper their ominous names, Hark or Dread, for the latter was the name since famous of one of his more recent recruits, he saw them to be white men, and shrank back stealthily beneath his covert. There he waited 2 days and 2 nights, long enough to satisfy himself that no one would rejoin him, and that the insurrection had hopelessly failed. The determined, desperate spirits who had shared his plans were scattered forever, and longer delay would be destruction for him also. He found a spot which he judged safe, dug a hole under a pile of fence rails in a field, and lay there for 6 weeks, only leaving it for a few moments at midnight to obtain water from a neighboring spring. food he had previously provided without discovery from a house nearby. Meanwhile, an unbounded variety of rumors went flying through the state. The Express, which first reached the governor, announced that the militia were retreating before the slaves. An express to Petersburg further fixed the number of militia at 300 and of blacks at 800, and invented a convenient shower of rain to explain the dampened ardor of the whites. Later reports described the slaves as making 3 desperate attempts to cross the bridge over the Notaway between Cross Keys and Jerusalem, and stated that the leader had been shot in the attempt. Other accounts put the number of Negroes at 300, all well-mounted and armed, with 2 or 3 white men as leaders. Their intention was supposed to be to reach the dismal swamp, and they must be hemmed in from that side. Indeed, the most formidable weapon in the hands of slave insurgents is always this blind panic they create, and the wild exaggerations which follow. The worst being possible, everyone takes the worst for granted. Undoubtedly, a dozen armed men could have stifled this insurrection, even after it had commenced operations, but it is the fatal weakness of a rural slaveholding community that it can never furnish men promptly for such a purpose. My first intention was, says one of the most intelligent newspaper narrators of the affair, to have attacked them with 30 or 40 men, but those who had families here were strongly opposed to it. 48. As usual, each man was pinioned to his own hearthstone. As usual, aid had to be summoned from a distance, and as usual, the United States troops were the chief reliance. Colonel House, commanding at Fort Monroe, sent at once 3 companies of artillery under Lt. Colonel Worth and embarked them on board the steamer Hampton for Suffolk. These were joined by detachments from the United States ships Warren and Natchez, the whole amounting to nearly 800 men. 2 volunteer companies went from Richmond, 4 from Petersburg, 1 from Norfolk, 1 from Portsmouth, and several from North Carolina. The militia of Norfolk, Nansemond, and Princess Anne counties and the United States troops at Old Point Comfort were ordered to scour the dismal swamp, where it was believed that 2,000 or 3,000 fugitives were preparing to join the insurgents. It was even proposed to send 2 companies from New York and 1 from New London to the same point. When these various forces reached Southampton County, they found all labor paralyzed and whole plantations abandoned. A letter from Jerusalem, dated August 24, says, "The oldest inhabitant of our county has never experienced such a distressing time as we have had since Sunday night last. Every house, room, and corner in this place is full of women and children, driven from home, who had to take the woods until they could get to this place. For many miles around their track," says another, "the county is deserted by women and children." Still another writes, "Jerusalem is full of women, most of them from the other side of the river, about 200 at Vix's." Then follow descriptions of the sufferings of these persons, many of whom had lain night after night in the woods. But the immediate danger was at an end, the short-lived insurrection was finished, and now the work of vengeance was to begin. In the frank phrase of a North Carolina correspondent, the massacre of the whites was over, and the white people had commenced the destruction of the Negroes, which was continued after our men got there from time to time, as they could fall in with them, all day yesterday. A postscript adds that passengers by the Fayetteville stage say that, by the latest accounts, 120 Negroes had been killed, this being little more than 1 day's work. These murders were defended, as Nat Turner defended his. A fearful blow must be struck. In shuddering at the horrors of the insurrection, we have forgotten the far greater horrors of its suppression. The newspapers of the day contain many indignant protests against the cruelties which took place. "It is with pain," says a correspondent of the National Intelligencer, September 7, 1831, "that we speak of another feature of the Southampton Rebellion, for we have been most unwilling to have our sympathies for the sufferers diminished or affected by their misconduct. We allude to the slaughter of many blacks without trial and under circumstances of great barbarity. We met with an individual of intelligence who told us that he himself had killed between 10 and 15. We, the Richmond troop, witnessed with surprise the sanguinary temper of the population, who evinced a strong disposition to inflict immediate death on every prisoner. There is a remarkable official document from General Epps, the officer in command, to be found in the Richmond Enquirer for September 6, 1831. It is an indignant denunciation of precisely these outrages, and though he refuses to give details, he supplies their place by epithets revolting, inhuman, and not to be justified, acts of barbarity and cruelty, acts of atrocity. This course of proceeding dignifies the rebel and the assassin with the sanctity of martyrdom, and he ends by threatening martial law upon all future transgressors. Such general orders are not issued except in rather extreme cases. And in the parallel columns of the newspaper, the innocent editor prints equally indignant descriptions of Russian 49 atrocities in Lithuania, where the Poles were engaged in active insurrection amid profuse sympathy from Virginia. The truth is, it was a reign of terror. Volunteer patrols rode in all directions, visiting plantations. It was with the greatest difficulty, said General Broadnax before the House of Delegates, and at the hazard of personal popularity and esteem, that the coolest and most judicious among us could exert an influence sufficient to restrain an indiscriminate slaughter of the blacks who were suspected. A letter from the Reverend G.W. Powell declares, "There are thousands of troops searching in every direction, and many Negroes are killed every day. The exact number will never be ascertained." Petition after petition was subsequently presented to the legislature, asking compensation for slaves thus assassinated without trial. Men were tortured to death, burned, maimed, and subjected to nameless atrocities. The overseers were called on to point out any slaves whom they distrusted, and if any tried to escape, they were shot down. Nay, worse than this. A party of horsemen started from Richmond with the intention of killing every colored person they saw in Southampton County. They stopped opposite the cabin of a free colored man who was hoeing in his little field. They called out, "Is this Southampton County?" He replied, "Yes, sir, you have just crossed the line by yonder tree." They shot him dead and rode on. This is from the narrative of the editor of the Richmond Whig, who was then on duty in the militia and protested manfully against these outrages. Some of these scenes, he adds, are hardly inferior in barbarity to the atrocities of the insurgents. These were the master's stories. If even these conceded so much, it would be interesting to hear what the slaves had to report. I am indebted to my honored friend, Lydia Maria Child, for some vivid recollections of this terrible period. As noted down from the lips of an old colored woman, once well known in New York, Charity Bowery. At the time of the old prophet Nat, she said, the colored folks was afraid to pray loud, for the whites threatened to punish 'em dreadfully if the least noise was heard. The patrols was low drunken whites, and in Nat's time, if they heard any of the colored folks praying or singing a hymn, they would fall upon 'em and abuse 'em, and sometimes kill 'em, before master or missus could get to 'em. The brightest and best was killed in Nat's time. The whites always suspect such ones. They killed a great many at a place called Duplon. They killed Antonio, a slave of Mr. J. Stanley, whom they shot. Then they pointed their guns at him and told him to confess about the insurrection. He told them he didn't know anything about any insurrection. They shot several balls through him, quartered him, and put his head on a pole at the fork of the road leading to the court. This is no exaggeration, if the Virginia newspapers may be taken as evidence. It was there but a short time. He had no trial. They never do. In Nat's time, the patrols would tie up the free colored people, flog 'em, and try to make 'em lie against one another, and often killed them before anybody could interfere. Mr. James Cole, High Sheriff, said, if any of the patrols came on his plantation, he would lose his life in defense of his people. One day he heard a patroller boasting how many niggers he had killed. Mr. Cole said, if you don't pack up as quick as God Almighty will let you and get out of this town and never be seen in it again, I'll put you where dogs won't bark at you. He went off and wasn't seen in them parts again. These outrages were not limited to the colored population, but other instances occurred which strikingly remind one of more recent times. An Englishman named Robinson was engaged in selling books at Petersburg, an alarm being given one night that 500 blacks were marching towards the town. He stood guard with others on the bridge. After the panic had a little subsided, he happened to remark that the blacks, as men, were entitled to their freedom and ought to be emancipated. This led to great excitement, and he was warned to 50 leave town. He took passage in the stage, but the stage was intercepted. He then fled to a friend's house. The house was broken open, and he was dragged forth. The civil authorities, being applied to, refused to interfere. The mob stripped him, gave him a great number of lashes, and sent him on foot, naked, under a hot sun, to Richmond, whence he with difficulty found a passage to New York. Of the capture or escape of most of that small band who met with Nat Turner in the woods upon the Travis plantation, little can now be known. All appear among the list of convicted, except Henry and Will. General Moore, who occasionally figures as second in command in the newspaper narratives of that day, was probably the Hark or Hercules before mentioned, as no other of the Confederates had belonged to Mrs. Travis, or would have been likely to bear her previous name of Moore. As usual, the newspapers state that most, if not all, the slaves were the property of kind and indulgent masters. The subordinate insurgents sought safety as they could. A free colored man, named Will Artist, shot himself in the woods where his hat was found on a stake and, his pistol lying by him. Another was found drowned. Others were traced to the dismal swamp. Others returned to their homes and tried to conceal their share in the insurrection, assuring their masters that they had been forced against their will to join, the usual defense in such cases. The number shot down at random must, by all accounts, have amounted to many hundreds, but it is past all human registration now. The number who had a formal trial, such as it was, is officially stated at 55. Of these, 17 were convicted and hanged, 12 convicted and transported, 20% acquitted, and 4 free. Colored men sent on for further trial and finally acquitted. Not one of those known to be concerned escaped. Of those executed, one only was a woman, Lucy, slave of John T. Barrow. There is one touching story in connection with these terrible retaliations, which rests on good authority, that of the Reverend M.B. Cox, a Liberian missionary. Then in Virginia, in the hunt which followed the massacre, a slaveholder went into the woods, accompanied by a faithful slave who had been the means of saving his life during the insurrection. When they had reached a retired place in the forest, the man handed his gun to his master, informing him that he could not live a slave any longer, and requesting him either to free him or shoot him on the spot. The master took the gun, in some trepidation, leveled it at the faithful Negro, and shot him through the heart. It is probable that this slaveholder was a Dr. Blunt, his being the only plantation where the slaves were reported as thus defending their masters. If this be true, said the Richmond Enquirer, when it first narrated this instance of loyalty, great will be the desert of these noble-minded Africans. Meanwhile, the panic of the whites continued, for, though all others might be disposed of, Nat Turner was still at large. We have positive evidence of the extent of the alarm, although great efforts were afterwards made to represent it as a trifling affair. A distinguished citizen of Virginia wrote, 3 months later, to the Honorable W.B. Seabrook of South Carolina, from all that has come to my knowledge, during and since that affair, I am convinced most fully that every black preacher in the country east of the Blue Ridge was in the secret. There is much reason to believe, says the governor's message on December 6, that the spirit of insurrection was not confined to Southampton. Many convictions have taken place elsewhere, and some few in distant counties. The withdrawal of the United States troops after some 10 days' service was a signal for fresh excitement, and an address, numerously signed, was presented to the United States government, imploring their continued stay. More than 3 weeks after the first alarm, the governor sent a supply of arms into Prince William, Fauquier, and Orange counties. From examinations which have taken place in other counties, says one of the best newspaper historians of the affair in the Richmond Enquirer of Sept. 6, I fear that the 51 scheme embraced a wider sphere than I at first supposed. Nat Turner himself, intentionally or otherwise, increased the confusion by denying all knowledge of the North Carolina outbreak, and declaring that he had communicated his plans to his 4 confederates within 6 months, while, on the other hand, a slave girl, 16 or 17 years old, belonging to Solomon Parker, testified that she had heard the subject discussed for 18 months, and that at a meeting held during the previous May some 8 or 10 had joined the plot. It is astonishing to discover, by laborious comparison of newspaper files, how vast was the immediate range of these insurrectionary alarms. Every southern state seems to have borne its harvest of terror. On the eastern shore of Maryland, great alarm was at once manifested, especially in the neighborhood of Easton and Snow Hill, and the houses of colored men were searched for arms even in Baltimore. In Delaware, there were similar rumors through Sussex and Dover counties. There were arrests and executions, and in Somerset County great public meetings were held to demand additional safeguards. On Election Day in Seaford, some young men going out to hunt rabbits discharged their guns in sport. The men being absent, all the women in the vicinity took to flight. The alarm spread. Like the Ipswich fright, soon Seaford was thronged with armed men, and when the boys returned from hunting, they found cannon drawn out to receive them. In North Carolina, Raleigh and Fayetteville were put under military defense, and women and children concealed themselves in the swamps for many days. The rebel organization was supposed to include 2,046 slaves were imprisoned in Union County, 25 in Sampson County, and 23 at least in Duplin County, some of whom were executed. The panic also extended into Wayne, New Hanover, and Lenoir counties. 4 men were shot without trial in Wilmington: Nimrod, Abraham, Prince, and Dan the drayman, the latter a man of 70, and their heads placed on poles at the 4 corners of the town. Nearly 2 months afterwards, the trials were still continuing, and at a still later day, the governor, in his proclamation, recommended the formation of companies of volunteers in every county. In South Carolina, General Hayne issued a proclamation to prove the groundlessness of the existing alarms, thus implying that serious alarms existed. In Macon, GA, the whole population were roused from their beds at midnight by a report of a large force of armed Negroes 5 miles off. In an hour, every woman and child was deposited in the largest building of the town, and a military force hastily collected in front. The editor of the Macon Messenger excused the poor condition of his paper a few days afterwards by the absorption of his workmen in patrol duties, and describes dismay and terror as the condition of the people of all ages and sexes. In Jones, Twiggs, and Monroe counties, the same alarms were reported, and in one place several. Slaves were tied to a tree, while a militia captain hacked at them with his sword. In Alabama, at Columbus and Fort Mitchell, a rumor was spread of a joint conspiracy of Indians and Negroes. At Claiborne, the panic was still greater. The slaves were said to be thoroughly organized through that part of the state, and multitudes were imprisoned, the whole alarm being apparently founded on one stray copy of the Boston Liberator. In Tennessee, the Shelbyville Freeman announced that an insurrectionary plot had just been discovered, barely in time for its defeat, through the treachery of a female slave. In Louisville, KY, a similar organization was discovered or imagined, and arrests were made in consequence. The papers, from motives of policy, do not notice the disturbance, wrote one correspondent to the Portland Courier. Pity us, he added. 52. But the greatest bubble burst in Louisiana. Captain Alexander, an English tourist, arriving in New Orleans at the beginning of September, found the whole city in tumult. Handbills had been issued, appealing to the slaves to rise against their masters, saying that all men were born equal, declaring that Hannibal was a black man, and that they also might have great leaders among them. 1,200 stand of weapons were said to have been found in a black man's house. 500 citizens were under arms, and 4 companies of regulars were ordered to the city, whose barracks Alexander himself visited. If such was the alarm in New Orleans, the story, of course, lost nothing by transmission to other slave states. A rumor reached Frankfort Kai that the slaves already had possession of the coast, both above and below New Orleans. But the most remarkable circumstance is that all this seems to have been a mere revival of an old terror once before excited and exploded. The following paragraph had appeared in the Jacksonville GA Observer during the spring previous. Fearful discovery. We were favored by yesterday's mail with a letter from New Orleans of May 1, in which we find that an important discovery had been made a few days previous in that city. The following is an extract. 4 days ago, as some planters were digging underground, they found a square room containing 11,000 stand of arms and 15,000 cartridges, each of the cartridges containing a bullet. It is said the Negroes intended to rise as soon as the sickly season began, and obtain possession of the city by massacring the white population. The same letter states that the mayor had prohibited the opening of Sunday schools for the instruction of blacks, under a penalty of $500 for the first offense, and, for the second, death. Such were the terrors that came back from 9 other slave states, as the echo of the voice of Nat Turner. And when it is also known that the subject was at once taken up by the legislatures of other states where there was no public panic, as in Missouri and Tennessee, and when finally it is added that reports of insurrection had been arriving all that year from Rio Janeiro, Martinique, St. Jago, Antigua, Caracas, and Tortola, it is easy to see with what prolonged distress the accumulated terror must have weighed down upon Virginia during the 2 months that Nat Turner lay hid. True, there were 1,000 men in arms in Southampton County to inspire security, but the blow had been struck by only 7 men before, and unless there were an armed guard in every house, who could tell but any house might at any moment be the scene of new horrors? They might kill or imprison Negroes by day, but could they resist their avengers by night? The half cannot be told, wrote a lady from another part of Virginia at this time, of the distresses of the people. In Southampton County, the scene of the insurrection, the distress beggars description. A gentleman who has been there says that even here, where there has been great alarm, we have no idea of the situation of those in that county. I do not hesitate to believe that many Negroes around us would join in a massacre as horrible as that which has taken place, if an opportunity should offer. Meanwhile, the cause of all this terror was made the object of desperate search. On Sept, the governor offered a reward of $500 for his capture, and there were other rewards swelling the amount to $1,100, but in vain. No one could track or trap him. On Sept, 30 amended account of his capture appeared in the newspapers, but it was wholly false. On October 7, there was another, and on October 18 another, yet all without foundation. Worn out by confinement in his little cave, Nat Turner grew more adventurous and began to move about stealthily, by night afraid to speak to any human being, but hoping to obtain some information that might aid his escape. Returning regularly to his retreat before daybreak, he might possibly have continued this mode of life until pursuit had ceased. At 53, not a dog succeeded where men had failed. The creature accidentally smelt out the provisions hid in the cave and finally led thither his masters, 2 Negroes, one of whom was named Nelson. On discovering the formidable fugitive, they fled precipitately when he hastened to retreat in an opposite direction. This was on October 15, and from this moment the neighborhood was all alive with excitement, and 500 or 600 men undertook the pursuit. It shows a more than Indian adroitness in Nat Turner to have escaped capture any longer. The cave, the arms, the provisions were found, and, lying among them, the notched stick of this miserable Robinson Crusoe, marked with 5 weary weeks and 6 days. But the man was gone. For 10 days more he concealed himself among the wheat stacks on Mr. Francis' plantation, and during this time was reduced almost to despair. Once he decided to surrender himself, and walked by night within 2 miles of Jerusalem before his purpose failed him. 3 times he tried to get out of that neighborhood, but in vain. Traveling by day was, of course, out of the question, and by night he found it impossible to elude the patrol. Again and again, therefore, he returned to his hiding place, and, during his whole 2 months' liberty, never went 5 miles from the Cross Keys. On the 25th of October, he was at last discovered by Mr. Francis. As he was emerging from a stack, a load of buckshot was instantly discharged at him, 12 of which passed through his hat as he fell to the ground. He escaped even then, but his pursuers were rapidly concentrating upon him, and it is perfectly astonishing that he could have eluded them for 5 days more. On Sunday, October 30, a man named Benjamin Phipps, going out for the first time on patrol duty, was passing. At noon, a clearing in the woods, where a number of pine trees had long since been felled, there was a motion among their boughs. He stopped to watch it, and through a gap in the branches he saw, emerging from a hole in the earth beneath, the face of Nat Turner. Aiming his gun instantly, Phipps called on him to surrender. The fugitive, exhausted with watching and privation, entangled in the branches, armed only with a sword, had nothing to do but to yield, sagaciously reflecting also, as he afterwards explained, that the woods were full of armed men, and that he had better trust fortune for some later chance of escape, instead of desperately attempting it then. He was correct in the first impression, since there were 50 armed scouts within a circuit of 2 miles. His insurrection ended where it began, for this spot was only 1.5 miles from the house of Joseph Travis. Tom, emaciated, ragged, a mere scarecrow, still wearing the hat perforated with buckshot, with his arms bound to his sides, he was driven before the leveled gun to the nearest house, that of a Mr. Edwards. He was confined there that night, but the news had spread so rapidly that within an hour after his arrival 100 persons had collected, and the excitement became so intense that it was with difficulty he could be conveyed alive to Jerusalem. The enthusiasm spread instantly through Virginia. M. Tresvant, the Jerusalem postmaster, sent notices of it far and near, and Gov. Floyd himself wrote a letter to the Richmond Enquirer to give official announcement of the momentous capture. When Nat Turner was asked by Mr. T.R. Gray, the counsel assigned him, whether, although defeated, he still believed in his own providential mission, he answered, as simply as one who came 30 years after him, was not Christ crucified? In the same spirit, when arraigned before the court, he answered, not guilty, saying to his counsel that he did not feel so, but apparently no argument was made in his favor by his counsel, nor were any witnesses called, he being convicted on the testimony of Levi Waller and upon his own confession, which was put in by Mr. Gray and acknowledged by the prisoner before the 6 justices composing the court, as being full, free, and voluntary. He was therefore placed in the paradoxical position of conviction by his own confession, under a plea of not guilty. The arrest took place on the October 30th, 1831, the confession on the 1st of November, 54, the trial and conviction on the 5th, and the execution on the following Friday, the 11th of November, precisely at noon. He met his death with perfect composure, declined addressing the multitude, assembled, and told the sheriff in a firm voice that he was ready. Another account says that he betrayed no emotion and even hurried the executioner in the performance of his duty. Not a limb nor a muscle was observed to move. His body after his death was given over to the surgeons for dissection. The confession of the captive was published under authority of Mr. Gray in a pamphlet at Baltimore. 50,000 copies of it are said to have been printed, and it was embellished with an accurate likeness of the brigand, taken by Mr. John Crawley, portrait painter, and lithographed by Endicott and Swett at Baltimore. The newly established liberators said of it at the time that it would only serve to rouse up other leaders and hasten other insurrections, and advised grand juries to indict Mr. Gray. I have never seen a copy of the original pamphlet. It is not easily to be found in any of our public libraries, and I have heard of but one as still existing, although the confession itself has been repeatedly reprinted. Another small pamphlet, containing the main features of the outbreak, was published at New York during the same year, and this is in my possession. But the greater part of the facts which I have given were gleaned from the contemporary newspapers, who now shall go back 30 years, and read the heart of this extraordinary man, who, by the admission of his captors, never was known to swear an oath, or drink a drop of spirits, who, on the same authority, for natural intelligence and quickness of apprehension was surpassed by few men, with a mind capable of attaining anything, who knew no book but his Bible, and that by heart, who devoted himself soul and body to the cause of his race, without a trace of personal hope or fear, who laid his plans so shrewdly that they came at last with less warning than any earthquake on the doomed community around, and who, when that time arrived, took the life of man, woman, and child, without a throb of compunction, a word of exultation, or an act of superfluous outrage. Mrs. Stowe's dread seems dim and melodramatic beside the actual Nat Turner, and De Quincey's Avenger is his only parallel in imaginative literature. Mr. Gray, his counsel, rises into a sort of bewildered enthusiasm with the prisoner before him. I shall not attempt to describe the effect of his narrative, as told and commented on by himself in the condemned hole of the prison. The calm, deliberate composure with which he spoke of his late deeds and intentions, the expression of his fiend-like face when excited by enthusiasm, still bearing the stains of the blood of helpless innocence about him, clothed with rags and covered with chains, yet daring to raise his manacled hands to heaven. With a spirit soaring above the attributes of man, I looked on him, and the blood curdled in my veins. But the more remarkable the personal character of Nat Turner, the greater the amazement. Felt that he should not have appreciated the extreme felicity of his position as a slave. In all insurrections, the standing wonder seems to be that the slaves most trusted and best used should be most deeply involved. So in this case, as usual, men resorted to the most astonishing theories of the origin of the affair. One attributed it to Freemasonry, and another to free whiskey, liberty appearing dangerous even in these forms. The poor whites charged it upon the free colored people, and urged their expulsion, forgetting that in North Carolina the plot was betrayed by one of this class, and that in Virginia there were but 2 engaged, both of whom had slave wives. The slaveholding clergyman traced it to want of knowledge of the Bible, forgetting that Nat Turner knew scarcely anything else. On the other hand, a distinguished citizen of Virginia combined in one sweeping denunciation Northern incendiaries, tracts, Sunday schools, religion, reading, and writing. But whether the theories of its origin were wise or foolish, the insurrection made its mark, and the famous band of Virginia emancipationists, who all that winter made the House of Delegates ring with unavailing eloquence, till the rise of slave exportation to new cotton regions stopped their voices, were but the unconscious mouthpieces of Nat Turner. In January 1832, in reply to a member who had called the outbreak a petty affair, the eloquent James M.C. Dowell thus described the impression it left behind. Now, sir, I ask gentlemen, in conscience to say, was that a petty affair which startled the feelings of your whole population, which threw a portion of it into alarm, a portion of it into panic, which wrung out from an affrighted people the thrilling cry, day after day, conveyed to your executive, we are in peril of our lives, send us an army for defense? Was that a petty affair which drove families from their homes, which assembled women and children in crowds without shelter, at places of common refuge, in every condition of weakness and infirmity, under every suffering which want and terror could inflict, yet willing to endure all, willing to meet death from famine, death from climate, death from hardships, preferring anything rather than the horrors of meeting it from a domestic assassin? Was that a petty affair which erected a peaceful and confiding portion of the state into a military camp, which outlawed from pity the unfortunate beings whose brothers had offended, which barred every door, penetrated every bosom with fear or suspicion, which so banished every sense of security from every man's dwelling, that let but a hoof or horn break upon the silence of the night, and an aching throb would be driven to the heart. The husband would look to his weapon, and the mother would shudder and weep upon her cradle. Was it the fear of Nat Turner and his deluded drunken handful of followers which produced such effects? Was it this that induced distant counties, where the very name of Southampton was strange, to arm and equip for a struggle? No, sir, it was the suspicion eternally attached to the slave himself, the suspicion that a Nat Turner might be in every family, that the same bloody deed might be acted over at any time and in any place, that the materials for it were spread through the land, and were always ready for a like explosion. Nothing but the force of this withering apprehension, nothing but the paralyzing and deadening weight with which it falls upon and prostrates the heart of every man who has helpless dependents to protect. Nothing but this could have thrown a brave people into consternation, or could have made any portion of this powerful commonwealth, for a single instant, to have quailed and trembled. While these things were going on, the enthusiasm for the Polish Revolution was rising to its height. The nation was ringing with a peal of joy on hearing that at Frankfurt the Poles had killed 14,000 Russians. The Southern Religious Telegraph was publishing an impassioned address. To Kosciuszko, standards were being consecrated for Poland in the larger cities. Heroes like Skrzynecki, Czartoryski, Rosycki, Ramiński were choking the trump of fame with their complicated patronymics. These are all forgotten now, and this poor Negro, who did not even possess a name beyond one abrupt monosyllable. For even the name of Turner was the master's property, still lives, a memory of terror and a symbol of wild retribution.